What if the worst catastrophe in human history was also the thing that built the world you live in? In just 5 years, a disease nobody understood killed a third of Europe, and out of that wreckage came the end of feudalism, the Renaissance, and the birth of public health as we know it. This is Luminous Starlight Audiobooks, and this is the complete audiobook of what the Black Death built. Chapter 1. The Journey of a Bacterium. How Yersinia pestis traveled from the steppe to every shore, 1331 to 1347. The catapult. The bodies went over the walls in autumn 1346. The Mongol army besieging the Genos port of Kaffa on the Crimean coast had run out of patience and run into something worse, a plague that was dissolving its own camp faster than any defender could. Janibeg Khan, watching his men die in their hundreds, made a decision. He ordered the corpses of the dead loaded into the catapults and fired over the walls of Kaffa. Whatever was killing his army, he would give it to his enemies. The dying started the way it always started. A man complained of fever, felt a swelling under his arm, and was dead within 3 days. Then another. Then a dozen. The Mongol commander, Janibeg Khan, watched his army dissolving from the inside, and he made a decision that military historians have described as the first recorded act of biological warfare. He ordered his soldiers to load the plague dead into the catapults and fire them over the walls of Kaffa. The Genos merchants inside the city threw the bodies into the sea as fast as they could. They burned incense, said prayers, boiled vinegar, and did everything else that their medical knowledge suggested might help. Then, in the autumn of 1347, they loaded their ships and fled to Constantinople, to Messina in Sicily, to Genoa and Venice and Marseille. They carried silk and spices and silver, the ordinary cargo of the medieval Mediterranean trade. They also carried, in the bodies of the rats and the fleas living in every ship's hold, something they could not see and could not name. When their ships pulled into the harbors of Europe, the dockworkers who went aboard to unload the cargo found the sailors dead at their oars. The road from the steppe. The plague had not started at Kaffa. It had been traveling for years before it reached the Crimea, moving west along the same roads that silken horses and ambassadors had been moving along for a century, the trade routes of the Mongol Empire that stitched together the far ends of the known world. In 1886, a Russian archaeologist digging near Lake Issyk-Kul in what is now Kyrgyzstan found something that made him stop. The graves he was uncovering dated to 1338 and 1339, 8 years before Kaffa, 9 years before the plague reached Europe. Their inscriptions, carved in Syriac by Nestorian Christian merchants, recorded deaths at a rate that had no normal explanation. Several inscriptions named the cause directly: pestilence. The men and women buried beside that lake had died of something catastrophic, on a trade route in Central Asia, while Europe was still at peace. Modern DNA analysis has confirmed what the inscriptions suggested. The genetic signature of Yersinia pestis, the bacterium that causes plague, has been found in the teeth of the Issyk-Kul dead. The strain is the direct ancestor of every strain that killed Europeans in the following years. The plague did not come from China, as medieval chroniclers believed, or from the poisoned air that medieval doctors blamed. It came from the rodent populations of the Central Asian steppe, made the jump to human communities along the Silk Road, and traveled west with the trade that was supposed to bring wealth. A case study: what a flea does. Understanding how the plague killed requires understanding something that no one in the 14th century knew: the role of the flea. Xenopsilla chiopis, the rat flea, feeds on blood. When its host rat dies, it looks for a new host. It finds a human. It bites. And as it feeds, it regurgitates into the wound the bacteria that have been multiplying in its gut. The human's immune system responds, the nearest lymph node swells as the body tries to contain the infection, producing the characteristic lump, hard as stone and the size of an egg, that medieval witnesses described with such horror. This is the bubo. This is where the Black Death gets its clinical name, bubonic plague. If the bacteria stay in the lymph nodes, the victim has perhaps a 50% chance of survival. If they break into the bloodstream, septicemic plague, death is nearly certain and comes within hours, sometimes without any visible symptoms at all. If they reach the lungs, pneumonic plague, the victim begins coughing and can now infect others directly through the air, with a mortality rate approaching 100%. The same disease, the same bacterium, 3 different pathways, 3 different death sentences. Medieval physicians watching the epidemic could not understand why some patients lingered for days while others collapsed and died before the doctor arrived. They were watching 3 different diseases that happened to have the same cause. The plague moved along the same corridors that connected the Mongol world, and it moved at the speed of a flea. The specific cruelty of the flea as a vector is that it is invisible, ubiquitous, and egalitarian. It does not distinguish between the archbishop and the peasant, between the merchant and the monk. It lives in clothing, in bedding, in the straw on the floors of the grandest halls. The measures that medieval people took to protect themselves, burning herbs, avoiding bad air, fleeing to the countryside, addressed a threat they had correctly identified as environmental but could not eliminate. You cannot fumigate a flea. You cannot pray one away, either. The route west. The plague moved across the known world at a speed that still surprises epidemiologists modeling it, roughly 2 to 4 kilometers per day along major trade routes, faster in summer when fleas are more active, slower in winter, following human movement so precisely that its path reads like a map of medieval commerce. It reached Constantinople in the summer of 1347. It reached Sicily in October. By January 1348 it was in Marseille, Genoa, and Venice simultaneously, 3 separate ships, 3 separate introductions, 3 separate ignitions in the most densely populated cities in Europe. No one watching the ships arrive in those harbors understood what was aboard them. The Messina authorities, confronted with a ship full of dead and dying sailors, ordered it out of the port. It was the right instinct and it was far too late. The plague had already left the ship. It was in the rats on the docks, in the fleas on the rats, in the people who had come to unload the cargo before the bodies were discovered. Within weeks, Messina was dying. Within months, Sicily was dying. By the summer of 1348, all of Italy was dying, and the plague was moving north across the Alps into France and Germany and beyond. The people of the 14th century had a word for what they were watching: pestilence. They had a framework for understanding it: God's punishment for human sin. What they did not have was any mechanism for stopping it. They could pray. They could flee. They could blame the Jews, or the planets, or the bad air rising from the marshes. They could do none of these things and die anyway. The plague did not care what they believed about it. It moved at the speed of a flea. The world it was entering. Europe in 1347 was already in trouble before the first plague ship docked. The 14th century had opened with a century of population growth that had pushed farming onto marginal land, hillsides too steep, soils too thin, fields too far from water. When the weather turned cold in the early 1300s, the beginning of what climatologists now call the Little Ice Age, those marginal fields failed first. The Great Famine of 1315 to 1322 killed millions across northern Europe, not dramatically but steadily, through years of failed harvests and rising prices and children who grew up stunted and susceptible. The population that the plague found in 1347 was a population already weakened. This context matters for understanding why the Black Death killed the proportion it did. A well-nourished population with strong immune systems might have experienced the same epidemic and lost 20% instead of 40%. We cannot know. What we can say is that the plague arrived at a moment of maximum vulnerability after decades of malnutrition, after the 100 Years' War had begun disrupting the agricultural economy of France, after the Church had been shaken by the Avignon papacy and the political chaos of the previous generation. The societies that the plague struck were societies whose resilience was already compromised. The Mongol Empire, which had inadvertently delivered the plague to Europe through its trade routes, was itself dying. The same epidemic that traveled west along its roads was killing Mongol populations across Central Asia and China. The empire that had connected the Eurasian world in ways that had never existed before was fragmenting, partly from internal political pressures, partly from the same catastrophe it had helped spread. The plague that the Mongol trade routes delivered to Europe was also the plague that finished the Mongol world. The road that brought the death ran in both directions. The Genos merchants who fled Kaffa have been blamed for what followed. The blame is unfair, they did not know what was in the hold, and also, in a deeper sense, irrelevant. The plague was already moving through a dozen other ports on a dozen other ships. Kaffa was one door, not the only one. What the image of those fleeing merchants captures is something true not about blame but about the world the plague found, a world more connected than it had ever been, threaded together by trade routes that could move silk and spices and bacteria with equal efficiency from one end of the known world to the other. The Mongols had built the roads. The merchants had used them. The flea had simply followed. Source: The Great Mortality, An Intimate History of the Black Death, John Kelly, 2005. Chapter 2. The Autumn Nobody Survived Cleanly. What the First Witnesses Saw, and What It Did to Them, 1347 to 1348. The Notary's Account. Gabriel de Mussis smelled it before he saw it. The plague had a smell, he would write later, not the smell of ordinary decay but something that came from the living body itself, recognizable from the street, identifiable before you entered the room. He was a notary in Piacenza, trained to record what he observed rather than what he wished were true, and what he observed in the spring of 1348 was a city dying faster than it could be counted. He described the swellings that appeared in the armpits and groins of the sick, hard as stones, some the size of a walnut, some the size of an egg. He described the black patches that spread across the skin afterward, which gave the epidemic the name Black Death that later centuries would attach to it. He described the smell, a smell that came from the body itself rather than from ordinary decay, recognizable before you entered the room, identifiable from the street. He described the speed, men who went to bed healthy and were dead before morning, women who felt the first symptoms at noon and were delirious by evening and gone by dawn. He described the doctors who came to examine the sick and then fell sick themselves, and died alongside their patients. What makes de Mussis's account extraordinary is not the clinical detail but the emotional register. He was watching the dissolution of everything he understood as civilized life, and he was watching it happen to people he knew. Father abandoned child, he wrote. Wife abandoned husband. Brother abandoned brother. These were not abstractions. These were his neighbors. The social bonds that held a medieval city together, the obligations of family, the duties of care, the professional commitments of physicians and clergy were snapping one by one under a pressure they had never been designed to bear. Florence, the city that measured its own dying. No city produced more documentation of the Black Death than Florence, and no document has been read more often than the opening pages of Giovanni Boccaccio's Decameron, written in the immediate aftermath of the 1348 epidemic. Boccaccio was 35 years old when the plague arrived in his city. He was a writer of considerable gifts and a man of considerable personal courage, and he sat down and described what he had seen with a clarity that makes the pages uncomfortable to read even now. He described the abandonment of the social rituals of death, the laying out of the body, the gathering of family, the funeral procession to the church. These rituals had existed because they mattered. They marked the transition between life and death, they provided comfort to survivors, they maintained the fiction that death was a managed event rather than a random one. In 1348 Florence, they became impossible. The bodies were too many, the living were too frightened, the cemeteries filled too fast. Trenches were dug in the churchyards and the dead were lowered in on top of each other, layers of bodies separated by thin coverings of earth, unmourned, unnamed, uncounted. The Florentine records that survive from 1348 provide independent confirmation. The number of wills filed in the city's notarial registers, which is to say, the number of people who believed they were about to die and wanted to dispose of their property, spikes catastrophically in March and April of 1348 and then simply stops. Not because people stopped dying. Because there were no longer enough notaries alive to file the documents. The records fall silent in mid-sentence, a silence in the archive that is its own kind of testimony. A case study, Agnolo di Tura's 5 children. In the neighboring city of Siena, A shoemaker and amateur chronicler named Agnolo di Itura del Grasso left an account of the plague that is, by any measure, one of the most devastating documents in the history of human suffering. His chronicle covers the political history of Siena across several decades, written in a workman-like vernacular that suggests a man of intelligence but no formal education. When he reached 1348, something in his prose changed. Agnolo describes the great building project that had defined Siena's ambition for a generation, the expansion of the cathedral that was meant to make it the largest church in Christendom, simply stopping. The workers were dead, or fled, or too grief-stricken to continue. The unfinished walls of that expansion still stand in Siena today, rising to half their planned height and then ending, a monument to the exact moment when enough people died that a civilization's reach exceeded its grasp. Visitors to Siena who walk past that unfinished structure are walking past the physical record of what it means to lose, in a few months, half the people who were supposed to finish what you started. The third universal was the failure of authority. Every form of human authority was visibly incapable of stopping what was happening. The Church's impossible position. The Catholic Church in 1348 faced a crisis that no institution could have survived without damage. It was simultaneously the primary provider of medical care, through its hospital networks, the primary source of spiritual comfort, through its sacraments, the primary explanation for suffering, through its theology, and the primary employer of the educated men who might otherwise have provided leadership in the crisis. All of these functions were overwhelmed at once. The clergy died. This is the fact that medieval chroniclers return to again and again, with a mixture of horror and something that reads like accusation. The monks who ran the hospitals died in their hospitals. The priests who administered last rites died alongside the people receiving them. The bishops who organized the response died before the response was organized. In some English dioceses, the records show that the bishop was issuing urgent dispensations for laypeople to hear confession, because there were no longer enough priests alive to do it within weeks of the plague's arrival. The institution built to manage death was being managed by death. The theological problem was, in its way, worse than the institutional one. The Church's framework for suffering said that pain was punishment, that individual suffering reflected individual sin, and that collective catastrophe reflected collective moral failure. This framework had provided meaning for generations. It provided very little comfort in 1348, when the most obviously devout, the monks, the nuns, the pilgrims, the flagellants who whipped themselves through the streets seeking divine mercy, were dying at the same rate as everyone else. God was not protecting the righteous. The prayers were not working. The most powerful institution in Europe was visibly, publicly, undeniably failing to do the one thing it existed to do. What the witnesses all said. Read across the accounts of the first wave de Mussis in Piacenza, Boccaccio in Florence, Agnolo di Itura in Siena, the Irish friar John Cielwain in Kilkenny who left blank pages in his chronicle in case any man survive and any of the race of Adam escape this pestilence, and certain things recur with enough consistency to constitute a shared experience of catastrophe. The speed was the first, the interval between the first symptom and death measured in hours or days rather than weeks. Medieval death was supposed to give time for preparation, for gathering the family, making the will, receiving the sacraments, saying goodbye. The plague did not give time. The second was the breakdown of care. The corporal works of mercy, visiting the sick, burying the dead, were among the most fundamental obligations of Christian life. They collapsed under the plague not because people were uniquely selfish but because the scale of illness made the obligation impossible and because the visible connection between caring for the sick and becoming sick oneself made every act of charity a decision about whether to survive. The witnesses who describe abandonment are not describing moral failure. They are describing rational calculation under conditions that made normal morality impossible to sustain. The third was the silence. John Cielwain, writing in Kilkenny as the plague swept through Ireland, ended his chronicle with a sentence that has haunted readers for 6 centuries. I leave parchment to continue this work, if perchance any man survive and any of the race of Adam escape this pestilence and carry on the work which I have begun. Then the handwriting changes. A different hand, presumably someone who found the manuscript after Clyn died, wrote 3 words, "Here it seems the author died." The work that had been continued by a different hand, the one thing Clyn had hoped for, evidence that someone had survived to carry on, is followed by 3 words that extinguish it. Clyn died. Clyn died. The parchment survived. That is the Black Death in a sentence. The blank pages are still blank. The third was the silence. John Clyn, writing in Kilkenny as the plague swept through Ireland, ended his chronicle with a sentence that has haunted readers for 6 centuries. "I leave parchment to continue this work, if perchance any man survive and any of the race of Adam escape this pestilence and carry on the work which I have begun." Then the handwriting changes. A different hand, presumably someone who found the manuscript after Clyn died, wrote 3 words, "Here it seems the author died." The work that had been continued by a different hand, the one thing Clyn had hoped for, evidence that someone had survived to carry on, is followed by 3 words that extinguish it. Clyn died. Clyn died. The parchment survived. That is the Black Death in a sentence. The blank pages are still blank. Source: John Clyn's manuscript is preserved in Marsh's Library in Dublin. Scholars handle it carefully. The blank pages he left for the survivors are still blank, 670 years of blank, waiting for a continuation that never came. Sometimes the most honest thing a historian can do is leave space on the page and admit that the story ends here, in the middle, with the writer dead and the work unfinished and the catastrophe still going on outside the window. Chapter 3. What 1/3 means. The scale of loss and what it erased, 1347 to 1353. The arithmetic of catastrophe. 1 in 3. Say it quickly and it sounds almost survivable. 2 in 3 made it, after all. But stand in the churchyard of any European town that existed in 1347 and look at the graves, and the arithmetic begins to reassemble itself into something less abstract. This family gone entirely, that one reduced to a single child, those 2 brothers who inherited everything because everyone ahead of them in the line of inheritance died in the same month. The problem with the number is that it is an average, and the Black Death was not an average event. It was a catastrophe that struck different places with radically different force, that killed some communities entirely and left others almost untouched, that selected its victims not by their virtue or their sin but by the accident of which house a flea-carrying rat happened to enter. The best current estimates, built from parish records, tax rolls, and the genetic analysis of medieval cemeteries, put European mortality between 40 and 50%. Some Italian cities lost 60 or 70% of their populations. Some alpine villages lost almost no one. The variation was driven by density, how many people were packed into how small a space, and by trade connections, how quickly infected travelers arrived, and by the season, fleas are more active in warm months, and by a randomness that no medieval person could explain and no modern model can fully account for. 2 villages on the same road, 5 miles apart, could suffer completely different fates depending on which one a sick merchant stopped in to sleep. Florence lost between 45 and 60% of its population. Venice lost between 50 and 60% of its roughly 100,000 inhabitants in 1348 alone. These were not slow declines. They were vertical drops that happened within months, removing simultaneously half the artisans, half the merchants, half the clergy, half the physicians, and half the servants that had made those cities function. The infrastructure of civilization does not survive the removal of half its people. A village that stopped. The English village of Eyam in Derbyshire is remembered for the wrong plague, the 1665 outbreak in which the villagers famously quarantined themselves to prevent the spread to neighboring communities, a story of collective heroism that has been celebrated for 3 centuries. But Eyam's records from 1348 and 1349 preserve something more instructive, the specific texture of what it meant to lose, in a matter of weeks, half the people in a community that everyone knew by name. The pattern revealed in Eyam's records, and in the records of dozens of other English villages from the same period, is not a smooth statistical decline but a jagged, household-by-household catastrophe. Some families lost every member within a week. Others lost one person and were spared further grief. A father, 2 sons, a daughter-in-law, and 3 grandchildren might die in a single fortnight while the family next door buried nobody. The differential was partly determined by household density, more people sharing sleeping space meant more exposure, and partly by the random geography of which rat chose which house. What the village records reveal, more clearly than any aggregate statistic, is the destruction of accumulated knowledge. A 14th-century English village was held together not just by the labor of its people but by what those people knew. The miller knew the mill. The blacksmith knew the forge. The midwife knew which herbs helped and which harmed and when to send for the priest. The oldest farmers knew which fields flooded in wet springs and which held water longest in dry summers. When the plague killed half a village in a month, it killed not just the labor those people provided but the knowledge they carried in their heads, knowledge that existed nowhere else and that would take a generation to rebuild. A case study: the city that never finished its cathedral. In Siena, the plague left a monument that still stands. The city had been, in the 1340s, one of the most ambitious building projects in Christendom, the expansion of its cathedral into what would have been the largest Gothic church in Italy, dwarfing even Florence's Duomo. The walls of the planned new nave had risen to half their intended height when the plague arrived in the spring of 1348. By autumn, the workforce was gone. The money was gone. The men who knew how to continue the construction were dead or fled. The project simply stopped. The unfinished walls still stand in Siena today, rising to half their planned height and then ending, the stone exposed, the arches incomplete, the space between them now an open walkway that tourists photograph without always understanding what they are looking at. It is not a ruin. It is a record. The construction stopped at a specific moment, and the specific moment was when enough people died that the civilization that had been building it could no longer sustain the effort. Walking through that abandoned nave is walking through the exact week in 1348 when Siena's future became its past. The construction stopped at a specific moment, and that moment was when enough people died that the civilization building it could no longer sustain the effort. Siena never recovered its pre-plague population. The city that had been competing with Florence for dominance of Tuscany in 1340 was a quieter, smaller, less ambitious place by 1360. The plague had not destroyed it, people still lived there, traded there, governed there, but it had removed the specific momentum that makes a city grow rather than merely persist. The unfinished cathedral is the most visible evidence of what was lost, but the real loss was invisible. The bankers and merchants and craftsmen and scholars who did not die in Siena in 1348 because they had already been born and were now not born, the generation that the plague prevented from existing. The monasteries and what they held. The monasteries of medieval Europe were, among other things, the primary repositories of written knowledge, the scriptoria where manuscripts were copied, the libraries where they were preserved, the schools where the literate were trained. They were also, by the nature of monastic life, among the most vulnerable communities in Europe. Monks and nuns lived in close quarters, ate together, prayed together, nursed each other when sick. The communal life that made monasteries centers of intellectual community made them death traps. The mortality in English monasteries during the 1348 to 1349 outbreak is among the best documented aspects of the Black Death, because monastic record-keeping was careful and the records survived. At Christ Church Priory in Canterbury, 44 of 80 monks died, a mortality rate of 55%. At the Cistercian monastery at Mow in Yorkshire, 52 monks and 6 lay brothers died between August 1348 and January 1349, essentially wiping out the entire community in 5 months. Some smaller houses were simply gone, the last entry in the register, then nothing. The destruction of monastic communities destroyed more than the monks. It destroyed the ongoing projects, the manuscripts half-copied, the illuminations half-painted, the chronicles mid-sentence. It destroyed the teaching relationships through which the specific skills of the scriptorium were transmitted from master to novice, skills that could not be learned from books because the books had not yet been written. And it destroyed the institutional memory of the monasteries themselves, which lands they owned, which agreements they had made, which privileges they held, Knowledge that lived in the minds of the senior monks who died and that would take decades to reconstruct from the documents that had survived. What the silence sounds like. The most eloquent evidence for the scale of the Black Death is not in the chronicles or the demographic studies. It is in the records that end. The guild accounts that simply stop. The court cases that were never resolved because all the parties died. The building projects, not just Siena's cathedral, that were abandoned in mid-construction and never resumed. The letters that were written but never answered because the recipient was dead before the messenger arrived. The 14th century is full of silences where there should be noise. Gaps in the 14th century is full of silences where there should be noise. Gaps in the documentary record that are shaped exactly like catastrophe. Silence is its own kind of evidence. John Clyn, an Irish friar in Kilkenny, wrote a chronicle of the plague's arrival in Ireland that ends with one of the most haunting passages in medieval literature. He had been recording the deaths around him with the careful hand of a man trained to document things precisely. At the end of his final entry, he wrote, "I leave parchment to continue this work, if perchance any man survive and any of the race of Adam escape this pestilence and carry on the work which I have begun." Then the handwriting changes. A different hand added 3 words in the margin. Here it seems the author died. Clyn had left the pages blank for the survivors. He had hoped someone would come after him to fill them in. Someone did come, someone who read what he had written, understood what it meant, and added the 3 words that extinguished the hope. The blank pages are still blank. They are in Marsh's library in Dublin, and they have been blank for 670 years, waiting for a continuation that never came. That is what 1/3 means. Europe's population did not return to pre-plague levels until the late 16th century, 2.5 centuries of recovery, interrupted repeatedly by the plague returning in 1361, 1369, 1374, and beyond. The children of plague survivors grew up to face their own plague years. Their children faced another. For 7 generations, no one in Europe lived long enough to know what normal mortality looked like. The Black Death was not an event. It was a condition. And the world it made was made not just by the dying of 1347 but by all the dying that followed, wave after wave, until the middle of the 17th century when the plague simply stopped, and no one then, and no one now, can say with certainty why. Source: The Great Mortality, An Intimate History of the Black Death, John Kelly, 2005. Chapter 4. The Death Certificate of Feudalism. How the Plague Gave the Peasants the One Thing They Had Never Had, Leverage, 1348 to 1381. The morning after. In the summer of 1349, a landowner in the English county of Kent did something his grandfather would have found incomprehensible. He offered his surviving tenants higher wages than the law allowed. His harvest was rotting. Every able-bodied labourer within 5 miles knew it. They also knew there were 3 other lords with rotting harvests who needed them just as badly. For the first time in the history of English agriculture, the peasants had somewhere else to go. The feudal system that had organized European agriculture for 5 centuries rested on a single economic reality: there were always more peasants than land. Lords could demand labor services, extract rents, restrict movement, and enforce obligations on their tenants because the alternative for the tenant, starving without access to land, was worse than compliance. The entire apparatus of medieval serfdom, from the legal fiction that bound a peasant to his manor to the practical reality of the village court that enforced the lord's demands, depended on the peasant having no viable alternative. The plague destroyed that reality overnight. In the summer of 1349, a lord who tried to enforce his traditional labor demands on his surviving tenants faced a new calculation: the tenant could leave. There was land everywhere, because half the people who had been farming it were dead. There were lords everywhere who were desperate for workers and willing to offer better terms to attract them. The peasant who had never in his life had a credible threat to make suddenly had the most credible threat in the world: I will go somewhere else. The price of a labourer. The economic consequences of the plague's demographic shock were swift and visible. Wages for agricultural labor in England rose by 50 to 100% in the decade after the Black Death. De laboris who had worked for 2 pence before the plague were commanding 4 or 5 pence by 1360. Skilled craftsmen in the cities, masons, carpenters, tanners saw their wages double and in some cases triple. The arithmetic was simple. Half as many workers, the same amount of work to be done, meant each worker was worth twice as much. Prices for manufactured goods rose as well, because the craftsmen who made them were demanding higher wages. Food prices for wheat and barley and the other staples fell, because there were fewer mouths to feed and the survivors had, in many cases, inherited the grain stores of the dead. The peasant of 1360 was eating better, earning more, and paying less rent than his father had in 1340. He was also likely to be farming better land than his father, because the contraction of the cultivated area meant that the thin, marginal fields that hungry populations had put under the plough were being abandoned, and the surviving farmers were concentrating on the most productive soils. This improvement in the material condition of the surviving peasantry was not the gift of a benevolent ruling class. It was extracted, slowly and against fierce resistance, from lords who understood perfectly well what was happening and who tried by every available means to prevent it. The labor shortage gave peasants leverage. The peasants used it. And the lords, after a generation of rigid action, lost. A case study, the Statute of Laboris and its failure. The English government's response to the labor shortage was immediate and revealing. In 1349, within months of the plague's first wave, the King's Council issued the Ordinance of Laboris, which was confirmed by Parliament as the Statute of Laboris in 1351. The statute required all able-bodied men and women under 60 to accept work at pre-plague wage rates, the rates that had prevailed before the catastrophe that had killed half their neighbors. It prohibited employers from offering more than the legal maximum. It prohibited workers from demanding more than the legal maximum. It threatened imprisonment for those who refused to work at the legal rate. The statute was, in practical terms, a failure. It was not a complete failure. It was enforced sporadically, it kept wages somewhat lower than they would otherwise have been, and it created a record of prosecutions that tells historians an enormous amount about the post-plague labor market. But it could not change the fundamental reality that there were too few workers and too much work. Lords who needed their harvests brought in before the rains came could not afford to wait for the sheriff to prosecute their neighbors for paying a penny too much. Workers who could find better terms 2 villages over could not be prevented from seeking them, especially after the confusion of the plague years had loosened the bonds of villanage for many families who were no longer sure which manor they legally belonged to. The peasant who had never in his life had a credible threat to make suddenly had the most credible threat in the world: I will go somewhere else. The irony of the Statute of Laboris is that its attempt to freeze wages at pre-plague levels was both economically understandable and historically counterproductive. By making explicit the conflict between the interests of landowners and the interests of laboris, by codifying, in law, that the landowners expected the laboring classes to remain cheap despite their newfound scarcity, it created exactly the politicized consciousness that the feudal system had always depended on suppressing. The peasants who were prosecuted under the statute did not conclude that they had been wrong to ask for higher wages. They concluded that the law was the instrument of their oppressors. They were not wrong. The long dissolution. Serfdom did not end in England on a single day. It dissolved, unevenly, over the century following the Black Death, as the combination of demographic pressure, labor shortages, and accumulated legal disputes made it increasingly difficult for lords to enforce the old obligations and increasingly pointless to try. By 1500, most English peasants were legally free in a way their great-grandparents had not been: free to move, free to negotiate their labor, free to leave a lord whose terms they found unacceptable. The transition was uneven across Europe. In France, the same demographic forces produced similar outcomes, though the specific political history was different. In Eastern Europe, Poland, Bohemia, the lands east of the Elbe, the plague's demographic shock produced the opposite result. Lords who faced a labor shortage responded not by competing for workers but by tightening legal controls, binding peasants more firmly to the land precisely because they might otherwise leave. The second serfdom that emerged in Eastern Europe in the 15th and 16th centuries was, in some respects, a response to the same demographic reality that produced peasant freedom in the West, but filtered through different political institutions and power relationships. Feudalism did not end because of the Black Death. It ended because of the Black Death plus the 60 years of demographic pressure that followed, plus the rising expectations of a peasantry that had once tasted leverage, plus the accumulated failures of lords who tried to restore a world that the plague had made economically impossible to restore. The Black Death was not a revolution. It was a permission, the specific demographic permission for a class of people who had never had options to begin acquiring them. The system that replaced feudalism was not more just, exactly. But it was built by people who had learned, in the worst possible school, that the powerful could need the powerless. That knowledge, once acquired, is very difficult to take back. Wat Tyler, the leader of the 1381 English Peasants' Revolt, was killed not in battle but in a negotiating session. He rode forward to parley with the young King Richard II at Smithfield, was stabbed by the Lord Mayor of London during the meeting, and was dragged away and beheaded. His death did not end the revolt immediately. The peasants, who had not seen him fall clearly, were confused about what had happened, but Richard II rode forward himself, promised to meet the rebels' demands, and used the delay to allow the army to assemble. The promises were revoked within days. Richard's composure in that moment at Smithfield was, by any measure, remarkable in a 14-year-old king. Source: The Black Death, A History from Beginning to End, Hourly History, 2018. Chapter 5. What God Could Not Explain. The Plague and the Crisis of Medieval Faith, 1348 to 1380. The Prayer That Didn't Work. The Bishop of Bath and Wells was running out of priests. By the spring of 1348, they were dying faster than he could replace them, not from cowardice but from proximity, from the occupational hazard of sitting beside plague victims to administer last rites. In desperation, he issued a letter granting his surviving parishioners permission to confess to a layperson if no priest could be found. He added, with the careful phrasing of a man aware he was crossing a line, even, if necessary, to a woman. 7 centuries of sacramental theology, adjusted in an afternoon, because there was no one left to do it the proper way. It was an extraordinary concession. In 7 centuries of Christian practice in England, the last rites had been a priestly function, and the bishop knew exactly how extraordinary his dispensation was. But he had no choice. The priests were dying faster than they could be replaced, and the dying needed comfort faster than the church could provide it. The bishop's letter was a crisis management document, not a theological one. But the theological crisis it gestured at was real and was deepening every week. The Church's framework for suffering held that pain was meaningful, that individual illness was a consequence of individual sin, that collective catastrophe was a sign of collective moral failure, and that turning to God in prayer and penance was the appropriate response because God was listening and God could act. This framework had given meaning to suffering for centuries. In 1348, it was failing publicly and visibly. The prayers were not working. The processions of flagellants through the streets, whipping themselves bloody in acts of public penance designed to demonstrate the community's willingness to suffer for its sins, were not working. The burning of herbs, the ringing of church bells, the daily masses said for the dying, none of it was working. The plague killed the pious at exactly the same rate as the impious. It killed the monks who had devoted their lives to prayer. It killed the priests who administered the sacraments. It killed the pilgrims who had walked to the shrines of the saints seeking miraculous protection. God was not protecting them, and the Church could not explain why. The flagellants. They appeared in Germany in the summer of 1349, groups of men, sometimes hundreds strong, marching from town to town in processions of public penance. They wore white robes marked with red crosses. They sang hymns as they walked. When they arrived in a town, they gathered in the market square, stripped to the waist, and beat themselves with leather whips tipped with metal spikes until the blood ran down their backs, while the crowd watched and sometimes wept. Then they moved on to the next town. The flagellant movement was not new, it had appeared in earlier crises, but the Black Death gave it a scale and a fervor it had never had before. At its height, in the summer and autumn of 1349, it swept through the Rhineland and the Low Countries, attracting thousands of followers and the terrified veneration of the populations it passed through. The flagellants preached that the plague was God's punishment and that only sufficient suffering could satisfy divine justice. They offered their own bodies as a kind of sacrifice. If God needed pain, they would provide it. The Church condemned the movement. Pope Clement VI issued a bull against the flagellants in October 1349, ordering their dissolution and the arrest of their leaders. His reasons were partly theological. The flagellants were claiming that their self-punishment could substitute for sacramental confession, which was a direct challenge to priestly authority, and partly practical, as flagellant groups had been leading or inciting pogroms against Jewish communities across Germany. But the condemnation also reflected something that the papal court in Avignon understood perfectly well. The flagellant movement was a symptom of a loss of faith not in God but in the Church. People were seeking salvation outside the institutional framework that the Church controlled, and that was a more dang people were seeking salvation outside the institutional framework that the Church controlled, and that was a more dangerous challenge to ecclesiastical authority than any heresy. The Church was right to be afraid. It just had the wrong enemy. A case study: the Jews of Strasbourg. On February 14, 1349, Valentine's Day, though no one was thinking about that, the Jewish community of Strasbourg was burned alive. 2,000 people, by the estimates of contemporaries. They were herded into the Jewish cemetery. A wooden structure was built around them, and the structure was set alight. The accusation was that they had poisoned the wells, deliberately spreading the plague that was killing Christians across Europe. The accusation was false. It was also, by that point in the epidemic, almost irrelevant. The well poisoning accusation had been spreading across Europe for months, carried by the same trade routes that carried the plague itself. It had a certain terrible logic. The plague was killing Christians but seemed, to Christian observers, to be killing fewer Jews. This observation was not entirely accurate. Jewish communities died at comparable rates, but there were reasons why it might have seemed true. Jewish religious law required washing hands before eating and after certain bodily functions. Jewish communities were sometimes less densely packed into city centers than Christian ones. Jewish dietary restrictions meant Jews were less likely to handle the pigs and rats that served as plague vectors. None of these factors provided significant protection against Yersinia pestis, but they may have produced a marginally lower visible mortality that was enough, in a terrified community looking for an explanation, to make the accusation feel credible. The prayers were not working. The plague killed the pious at exactly the same rate as the impious. God was not protecting them, and the Church could not explain why. Pope Clement VI issued bulls in 1348 and 1349 pointing out that Jews were dying of the plague too and that the well poisoning accusation was therefore nonsensical. He offered his personal protection to Jewish communities and condemned the violence. The violence continued. The massacres that swept through the Jewish communities of Germany and France in 1348 and 1349, Cologne, Mainz, Frankfurt, Basel, Zurich, and dozens of smaller towns, were among the worst anti-Jewish violence in European history before the 20th century. They were driven not primarily by theology but by terror, by the need to find an agent for a catastrophe that had no visible cause, by the very human impulse to prefer a guilty enemy to a random universe. The mystical turn. Not everyone responded to the Church's visible failure by looking for someone to blame. Some responded by looking inward. The decades after the Black Death produced a flowering of mystical spirituality, a turn toward direct personal experience of the divine that bypassed the institutional Church, that had no real precedent in earlier medieval Christianity and that would eventually feed into the Reformation. The Rhineland mystics, Meister Eckhart, Johannes Tauler, Heinrich Suso, had been writing before the plague, but their emphasis on the individual soul's direct communion with God took on new urgency and new audiences in the post-plague years. Their message was, at its core, that the Church's intermediaries, the priests, the sacraments, the institutional machinery, were not the only path to God and perhaps not even the primary one. What mattered was the inner life, the direct experience of the divine, the cultivation of a relationship with God that did not depend on an institution that had just demonstrated its inability to protect its most faithful members. The Brethren of the Common Life, the Devotio Moderna, the later writings of Julian of Norwich, all of these movements, all of them products of the post-plague generation, share a common emphasis on personal piety over institutional religion. They were not, in most cases, deliberately anti-clerical. They were responding to a felt experience of abandonment, the sense that the Church had been present and praying and had not been enough, by seeking a more direct, more personal, more reliable connection to the sacred. The Reformation, which would split Christianity in the 16th century, drew on many sources. The Black Death, and what it did to the credibility of the institutional Church, was one of the most important. The faith that survived. The Black Death did not destroy medieval Christianity. The churches were rebuilt, the monasteries were repopulated, the sacramental machinery was repaired and restarted. The faith of the survivors was, in many cases, intensified rather than extinguished by what they had lived through. The literature of the post-plague years is saturated with religious imagery, with appeals to divine mercy, with the conviction that the plague had been a test that the survivors had somehow passed. But the specific quality of the faith changed. The pre-plague church had been an institution of confident hierarchy, of elaborate ritual, of the certainty that the system worked, that if you did the right things, said the right prayers, obeyed the right authorities, your soul was in good hands. The post-plague church was an institution that had been seen to fail, that had been caught without adequate theological resources to explain what had happened, that had lost a third of its clergy in months and had filled the vacancies with undertrained replacements. The survivors knew what the Church had not been able to do. That knowledge did not disappear when the plague receded. The Reformation that split Christianity in the 16th century had many causes: theological, political, economic, personal. But underneath all of them was a question that the Black Death had first made unavoidable. What exactly is the Church for, if it cannot protect you when it matters most? Luther did not ask that question in a vacuum. He asked it in a civilization that had been asking a version of it, quietly and without resolution, for 150 years. The plague planted the doubt. The Church never quite answered it. The harvest came in 1517, when a monk in Wittenberg nailed a list of grievances to a door, and the institution that had failed the dying of 1348 discovered that failure had a very long memory. Pope Clement VI, whose papacy coincided with the Black Death, spent much of 1348 sitting between two large fires in his apartments in Avignon. His physician, Guy de Chauliac, had advised him that the fires would purify the air and reduce the risk of infection. Whether the fires actually helped is debatable. The heat may have reduced the local flea population, but Clement survived the epidemic while many around him died. He issued 2 papal bulls protecting Jewish communities from persecution, condemned the flagellant movement, and ordered an autopsy of plague victims in an attempt to understand the disease's physical mechanism. The autopsy revealed nothing useful to medieval medicine, but the impulse to investigate rather than simply pray was itself significant. Source: In the Wake of the Plague, Norman Cantor, 2001. Chapter 6. The Doctor Who Could Not Help. Medicine, Miasma, and the Humiliation of the Learned, 1348 to 1400. The Consultation. The most distinguished physicians in Europe met in Paris in October 1348 and produced their verdict on what was killing everyone: the planets. Specifically, a conjunction of Saturn, Jupiter, and Mars in Aquarius on March 20, 1345, which had drawn up noxious vapors from the sea and corrupted the air of Europe. Philip VI of France had commissioned the report and wanted an answer. He got one. It was wrong in every particular, but it was the honest product of the best medical knowledge available, applied carefully by serious men to a problem their knowledge could not solve. This celestial event had drawn up noxious vapors from the sea and the earth, which had corrupted the air throughout the affected regions. People who breathed this corrupted air fell ill because the corruption entered through the pores of the skin and through the lungs and disrupted the balance of the four humors that governed the body's health. The diagnosis was wrong in every particular. But it was not stupid. It was the honest product of the best medical knowledge of the 14th century, applied carefully to a problem that knowledge could not solve. The physicians of Paris were working within a framework inherited from Galen and Hippocrates, refined by generations of Islamic and European scholarship that was internally coherent, that had a sophisticated understanding of the relationship between environment and health, and that was simply wrong about the fundamental mechanism of infectious disease. They had no concept of germ theory. They had no microscopes. They had no way to know that the actual cause of what they were treating was a bacterium transmitted by fleas. Their theory of miasma, bad air causing illness, was wrong about the agent but correct about the correlation. The plague did tend to strike in certain seasons, in certain places, in ways that suggested an environmental component. The practical recommendations that followed from the miasma theory, avoiding low-lying areas, burning aromatic herbs, keeping windows open to dispel the corrupted air, fleeing infected cities before the bad air spread, were useless against Yersinia pestis but not irrational given the theoretical framework. The tragedy of medieval medicine's encounter with the Black Death is not that the physicians were foolish but that the tools they had were inadequate to the problem they faced, and that they knew it. The anatomy of failure. The physicians who treated plague patients in 1348 were in an impossible position. They knew that treating patients put them at risk. The visible pattern of doctors becoming sick after seeing sick patients was obvious even without germ theory, and they treated patients anyway, at least some of them. They tried bleeding, which was the standard treatment for most conditions involving fever and swelling. They tried lancing the buboes, which was sometimes effective and sometimes accelerated the spread of infection. They tried a range of herbal preparations whose ingredients ranged from the useless to the actively harmful. They tried and failed and died. The mortality among physicians during the plague was among the highest of any occupational group. Guy de Chauliac, the papal physician who survived to write the most important medical account of the plague, recorded his own illness with clinical precision: the bubo, the fever, the 5-week crisis, the eventual recovery. He described himself as living in continual fear of death and shame that he could not do more to help his patients. This combination, the courage to continue practicing despite personal risk, combined with the humiliation of watching patients die despite everything he knew, is the defining experience of 14th century medicine. What the Black Death did to medicine, in the long run, was not destroy it but delegitimize its existing foundations. The framework that had produced the Paris faculty's report on celestial conjunctions was, after 1350, a framework that had been tested against the worst epidemic in human history and had failed. That failure did not immediately produce a better framework. The germ theory of disease would not be established until the 19th century, but it created a pressure toward observation, toward empiricism, toward the willingness to question authority that would eventually feed into the scientific revolution. A case study, Guy de Chauliac and what he learned. Guy de Chauliac was, by universal consent, the greatest surgeon of the 14th century. His textbook on surgery, the Chirurgia Magna, compiled before the plague arrived, was the standard reference for European surgeons for the next 2 centuries. When the plague came to Avignon in 1348, he stayed unlike many of his colleagues, who fled, and he observed, with the careful eye of a trained anatomist, what the disease did to the bodies of the people it killed. His account distinguishes between 2 forms of the plague: a form that killed within 2 to 3 days, with swellings in the groin and armpit, and a more rapidly fatal form with blood spitting and no visible swellings. He is describing, with 14th century terminology, the difference between bubonic and pneumonic plague, without any way to know that they were caused by the same agent by different transmission routes. This is careful observation in the absence of adequate theory, the best that 14th century medicine could do. They tried bleeding. They tried lancing the buboes. They tried herbal preparations. They died alongside their patients. The framework was wrong, and there was no other framework. De Chauliac's most significant contribution was not his clinical observations but his response to his own failure. After recovering from his own infection, he spent the rest of his career trying to improve the practical skills of surgeons, the manual techniques of cutting and draining and suturing, because he understood that the theoretical framework of medieval medicine had been broken by the plague and that the only thing that could be improved in the short term was technique. He is, in this respect, a figure at the turning point between medieval and early modern medicine, a man who had absorbed the limits of the old knowledge and was beginning, however tentatively, to look for something else. That tentativeness is where modern medicine begins. The bodies and what they taught. The plague produced, as a side effect, an unusual quantity of dead bodies that needed to be dealt with quickly. The normal processes of medieval burial, the ritual washing and preparation of the body, the vigil before burial, the procession to the churchyard, were impossible at the scale of 1348. Bodies were buried in mass graves, sometimes hundreds at a time, sometimes still wearing their clothes. The urgency of disposal meant that the social inhibitions against touching and examining the dead were, in practice, partially suspended. This created, inadvertently, opportunities for anatomical observation that had previously been rare. The Church's formal position on dissection was not the blanket prohibition that later mythology suggested. Papal bulls had in fact authorized the dissection of plague victims in 1348 specifically to understand the disease. But the cultural inhibitions against opening human bodies had limited autopsy as a medical practice. The plague normalized, to some degree, the handling of large numbers of corpses under urgent conditions. The generation of physicians who trained in the decades after the Black Death were physicians who had, as young men, participated in the disposal of mass death and who had in some cases used that access to examine what the plague did to the bodies it killed. The direct line from this experience to the anatomical revolution of the 15th and 16th centuries, to Vesalius and his Fabrica, to the great flowering of anatomical illustration that changed medicine's understanding of the human body, is not simple or direct. But the Black Death created conditions in which the examination of the dead became, in a crisis, a necessity rather than a transgression, and that normalization of autopsy practice contributed, over generations, to the empirical turn in medicine that would eventually replace the humoral theory that the plague had so publicly discredited. What medicine admitted. The most significant medical consequence of the Black Death was not any specific discovery or treatment. It was an admission. The admission was that the existing framework was insufficient, that the tradition of Galen and Hippocrates, refined over 15 centuries, had encountered a phenomenon it could not explain and could not cure, and that something would need to change. The change came slowly. Medicine is a conservative discipline, and the alternative to a wrong theory is not immediately a right one. The 14th and 15th centuries produced a range of responses to the collapse of medical authority: more careful clinical observation, more attention to specific treatments that seemed to work regardless of whether they fit the theory, more willingness to read the Islamic authors who had been translating and extending Galenic medicine in ways that the European tradition had not yet absorbed. None of these responses was the germ theory. But they were movements in the direction of empiricism, the willingness to let observation correct theory rather than to bend observation to fit theory. The four humours survived the Black Death. They persisted in medical textbooks for another 3 centuries, taught to generations of physicians who had no better framework to replace them with. But something had changed in the field, in the space between what the textbooks said and what physicians saw. Every doctor who watched a patient die despite the full arsenal of Galenic medicine was a doctor in whom a doubt had been seeded, not a doubt about medicine, but about this particular medicine, this particular explanation. The doubts accumulated quietly, passed from teacher to student in the margins of what was officially taught, and they eventually became Vesalius cutting open a human body in 1543 and saying, calmly, that Galen was wrong about the anatomy. The plague did not produce the scientific revolution. But it produced the doubt that the scientific revolution needed. The autopsy that Guy de Chauliac ordered on plague victims in Avignon in 1348 was one of the first systematic autopsies performed specifically to understand an infectious disease. It found no clear physical cause that medieval medicine could interpret usefully. The investigators reported that the internal organs appeared diseased but could not identify a mechanism. The limitation was not the investigators' skill but their framework. Without the concept of bacteria or the instruments to observe them, even careful anatomical examination could not reveal the actual cause of the plague. The autopsies were a failure in the short term and a precedent in the long one. Source: The Great Mortality, An Intimate History of the Black Death, John Kelly, 2005. Chapter 7. The Scapegoat. Fear, the Jews, and the Logic of Blame, 1348 to 1349. The Accusation. The story spread faster than the plague. By the autumn of 1348, it had reached most of the German-speaking lands before the disease itself had. The Jews were poisoning the wells. They had introduced a powder made, the report specified, of spiders and frogs and human hearts into the water supplies of Christian towns. The plague was not a natural catastrophe or a divine punishment. It was murder, deliberate and targeted, committed by a people who had always been suspected of harboring malice toward their Christian neighbors. The story was false. It was also, in a certain terrible way, useful. They had introduced a powder made of spiders and frogs and human hearts, the reports said, though the recipe varied with the teller, into the water supplies of Christian towns. The plague was not a natural catastrophe or a divine punishment. It was a deliberate act of murder, committed by a people who had always been suspected of harboring malice toward their Christian neighbors. The accusation was absurd on its face. Jewish communities were dying of the plague at rates comparable to their Christian neighbors. If the wells were poisoned, the Jews were drinking from them too. But the accusation was not, at its core, a claim about epidemiology. It was a claim about what kind of world people were living in, a world in which random catastrophe was intolerable and purposeful evil was, paradoxically, more manageable. If the plague was caused by Jewish poison, it could in principle be stopped by removing the Jews. If the plague was caused by bad air and celestial conjunctions, it could not be stopped at all. The accusation offered control, or the illusion of it, at the cost of a monstrous injustice. Pope Clement VI, in Avignon, saw through the accusation immediately. In July 1348 he issued a bull pointing out that Jews were dying of the plague in regions where they had no presence at all, that the plague had begun in lands where few Jews lived, and that the accusation was therefore without foundation. He offered his personal protection to Jewish communities and threatened excommunication for those who attacked them. The bulls were ignored. The massacres continued. The geography of murder. The violence moved from west to east through the German-speaking lands, arriving in each city a few months before or after the plague itself, sometimes in advance of the epidemic and sometimes in its wake. In Basel, the Jewish community, several hundred people, was locked in a wooden building and burned in January 1349. In Strasbourg, 2,000 Jews were burned in the Jewish cemetery on Valentine's Day. In Mainz and Cologne, the communities were among the largest in Germany. They were destroyed in the summer of 1349. In Erfurt, Frankfurt, Nuremberg, town after town, across the Rhineland, across Bavaria, across the Holy Roman Empire. In some cities, the Jewish communities defended themselves. In Mainz, Jewish men armed themselves and fought back against the attackers, killing a number of them before being overwhelmed. The resistance was futile against organized municipal violence, but it happened, and the chronicles record it with a mixture of surprise and grudging acknowledgement. In other cities, entire communities chose mass suicide over waiting to be killed, the men killing their wives and children and then themselves, as the attackers broke down the gates. The chronicles describe these scenes with the vocabulary of martyrdom, and the Jewish communities who experienced them commemorated the dead in the same terms. By 1350, the Jewish communities of most German cities had been destroyed. Some had fled east, to Poland and Lithuania, where rulers who wanted the commercial skills of Jewish merchants offered protection that the cities of the West had not. The demographic center of gravity of European Jewry, which had been in the Rhineland for centuries, shifted permanently eastward. The communities of Frankfurt and Mainz and Cologne that had been destroyed were slowly rebuilt by later arrivals, but the specific people who had built them, the specific people who had built those communities, the specific families who had lived in them for generations, were gone. The plague was still going. It had not noticed. A case study, the Confession of Balavignus. In September 1348, a Jewish physician named Balavignus was arrested in the town of Chillon on Lake Geneva and tortured until he confessed to the well-poisoning accusation. His confession, describing how he had been provided with a powder by a rabbi in Toledo and had distributed it to Jewish communities throughout the region for introduction into Christian wells, was copied and circulated to towns across the German-speaking lands as evidence that the accusation was true. The confession was obtained by torture and was therefore worthless as evidence. This was understood at the time by anyone who thought about it. A man in sufficient pain will confess to anything, and the specific details of Balavignus's confession, the rabbi in Toledo, the powder, the distribution network, were exactly the kind of details that a torturer who already believed the story would supply to a victim who only wanted the pain to stop. Clement VI understood this. Most educated observers understood this. The understanding did not prevent the confession from being used as it was intended to be used. Remove the Jews, and the plague would stop. It was wrong. It was monstrous. And it was, for a terrified population looking for any handhold in the dark, comprehensible. Balavignus was killed after his confession. The towns that received copies of his confession used them as justification for destroying their own Jewish communities. The mechanism was self-reinforcing. The confession produced more pogroms, and each pogrom produced additional confessions, and the confessions produced more pogroms, in a cycle that continued until the Jewish communities were gone and there was no one left to confess. The specific horror of the Chillon confession is not the torture, which was routine by medieval standards, but the way it demonstrates how a false story, once circulating, becomes true enough to kill by. Why it happened. The question that historians have argued about for a century is not whether the pogroms happened, they are too well documented for doubt, but why the accusation found such ready acceptance. The Jews of the Rhineland had been living alongside their Christian neighbors for generations. They were a familiar presence in the commercial life of German cities, known individually if not always treated well. The leap from known neighbor to genocidal poisoner was not a small one, and it happened in a matter of months. The answer lies partly in the existing structure of anti-Jewish prejudice in medieval Europe, which had been building for centuries through theological accusation, legal discrimination, and periodic violence. The well-poisoning accusation of 1348 was not invented out of nothing. It drew on earlier accusations of host desecration and ritual murder that had already established, in the popular imagination, the template of a Jewish community engaged in hidden acts of violence against Christians. The plague provided a specific event to which this template could be attached. The answer lies also in the specific psychology of catastrophe. When a catastrophe is random, when it kills the good and the wicked indiscriminately, when prayer has no effect and flight is often futile, the mind searches for agency. A plague that is nobody's fault is, in a certain sense, more terrifying than a plague that is somebody's fault, because a plague that is nobody's fault cannot be stopped by any human action. The accusation against the Jews offered a causal explanation and, with it, the possibility of control. Remove the Jews, and the plague would stop. It was wrong. It was monstrous. And it was, for a terrified and desperate population looking for any handhold in the dark, comprehensible. The aftermath. The pogroms of 1348 and 1349 were among the worst violence against Jewish communities in European history before the 20th century. They destroyed communities that had existed for centuries, killed tens of thousands of people, and created a refugee population that fundamentally altered the geography of European Jewry. And they did not stop the plague. The wells that had been accused of poisoning continued to carry water. The deaths continued at the same rate. The accusation was refuted, not by argument, but by the continued dying of a population that had supposedly removed the cause. The refutation produced no apologies, no rehabilitation of the murdered communities, no official acknowledgement that an injustice had been done. In many cities, the property of the destroyed Jewish communities, the houses, the goods, the books, the synagogues, was distributed among the perpetrators or seized by municipal governments. The economic incentive to believe the accusation, or to act as if one believed it, was not negligible. The debts that Christian merchants owed to Jewish moneylenders were, in cities where the Jewish community was killed, simply cancelled by the death of the creditors. The plague continued after the pogroms, of course. It had no opinion about Jewish guilt or innocence and adjusted its mortality accordingly, the same in towns that had destroyed their Jewish communities as in towns that had protected them. The people who had burned their neighbors watched the dying continue and drew no public conclusion from this. The anti-Semitism that produced the pogroms did not require the evidence to work. It was not, at its foundation, a theory that evidence could refute. What it required was fear, and the plague provided that in quantities that would not be exhausted for years. The Jews who rebuilt in the German cities afterward were building in the same place, on ground that had been cleared by their predecessors' murder, in communities that had watched and done nothing. They rebuilt anyway. That persistence is its own kind of answer to the question of what the Black Death cost. The town of Speyer, which had a significant Jewish community destroyed during the 1348 to 1349 pogroms, required the Jews who returned to rebuild their community afterward to pay for the city's expanded Jewish cemetery, the cemetery that had been created because the existing one filled up with plague dead. The survivors were required to fund the burial ground that commemorated the people who had been killed partly in response to the plague that was killing everyone else. The administrative logic was coherent. The moral logic was something else. Source: In the Wake of the Plague, Norman Cantor, 2001. Chapter 8. The Art of Dying. How the Plague Changed What Europeans Painted, Built, and Wrote, 1350 to 1430. The skeleton in the room. Before 1348, the skeletons in European art knew their place. They appeared in theological allegories, in depictions of the Last Judgment, in images of the good death at the end of a well-lived Christian life. They were instructive figures, morally ordered, associated with specific sins or specific virtues. After 1348, the skeletons started dancing. They danced with popes. They danced with kings. They danced with peasants who were still holding their shovels. They danced with equal enthusiasm and equal indifference, and they did not wait to be invited. After 1348, death in European art became something else, an impersonal force, a skeleton or a dancing corpse, that arrived without announcement and without discrimination, that seized the pope and the peasant, the young and the old, the righteous and the wicked, with equal indifference and equal certainty. The danse macabre, the dance of death, was the most distinctive artistic form to emerge from the post-plague generation. Its origins are debated, but it appeared in murals, woodcuts, tapestries, and manuscript illuminations across Europe in the second half of the 14th century and the first half of the 15th, always with the same essential structure. A procession of the living arranged in social order, from pope and emperor down through the ranks of clergy, nobility, and common people led by dancing skeletons. Each skeleton has its arm around a living person. The living person looks frightened or resigned. The skeleton is grinning. The danse macabre is often described as morbid, but this misreads its social function. It was a reminder and a leveler simultaneously. The reminder was that everyone died, that the emperor's purple robes offered no more protection than the peasant's rags, that the cardinal's mitre was as useless against the skeleton's grip as the merchant's purse. The leveler was implicit. If death made everyone equal, then the hierarchies of the living were, in some ultimate sense, arbitrary. The skeleton did not bow to the bishop. The skeleton did not spare the nobleman. The plague had demonstrated this empirically, and the danse macabre was the art that recorded the lesson. Boccaccio and the Comedy of Survivors. Giovanni Boccaccio's Decameron, written in the immediate aftermath of the 1348 plague, is one of the strangest books in the history of literature. It opens with one of the most devastating accounts of the epidemic ever written, the description of Florence during the plague that has been quoted, analyzed, and translated ever since, and then pivots, without transition, into 100 stories told by 10 young people who have fled the city to wait out the epidemic in a country house. The stories are funny. They are bawdy. They are full of people tricking each other, sleeping with each other, outwitting priests and husbands and merchant rivals. They are, in their total effect, a celebration of the vitality of survivors. The apparent disjunction between the plague opening and the comic stories is, on reflection, the point. Boccaccio was not changing the subject when he moved from the dead streets of Florence to the witty conversations of his 10 young storytellers. He was making an argument about what survival requires. The people who told stories, who laughed, who pursued pleasure and love and cleverness in the shadow of catastrophe, these were the people who were still alive. The people who had given in to despair, or who had tried to maintain the old pieties in the face of their obvious failure, or who had died in the service of the sick, these were the dead. The Decameron is a manual for surviving, and its prescription is earthly pleasure. The argument is not quite as cynical as this summary makes it sound. Boccaccio does not endorse cowardice. His framing device explicitly acknowledges that some people stayed to care for the sick, and he honors them. But the Decameron insists, with a force that no pre-plague writer could have mustered, that this life, in this world, with these pleasures, matters, that it is not simply a preparation for the afterlife but an end in itself. That insistence is one of the seeds of Renaissance humanism, planted in the fertile catastrophe of 1348. A case study, the triumph of death at Palermo. In the Palazzo Abatellis in Palermo, there is a fresco painted sometime in the late 15th century that goes by the name The Triumph of Death. It is one of the largest and most frightening paintings in European art. A skeletal figure on a skeletal horse charges through a crowd of people, shooting arrows into the crowd with a kind of furious exuberance. The arrows find the wealthy and the powerful, the bishop, the king, the court lady in her fine dress, with particular precision. The poor people, the sick people, the people already dying in the corner of the composition, are reaching toward the skeletal horseman with something that looks like longing, as if they want to be released from their suffering. The painting has been analyzed as social criticism, the arrows that find the rich and spare the poor as a comment on the inequity of mortality, and as religious art, and as straightforward memento mori. All of these interpretations are valid. What the painting captures most vividly is something that the Black Death had demonstrated with statistical clarity, that death was not a fate you could prepare for, negotiate with, or buy your way out of. The bishop's robes were not armor. The king's crown was not protection. The skeleton on the horse did not consult your social position before drawing the bow. The skeleton did not bow to the bishop. The skeleton did not spare the nobleman. The plague had demonstrated this empirically, and the danse macabre was the art that recorded the lesson. The Triumph of Death at Palermo is not, strictly speaking, a Black Death painting. It was made more than a century after the first outbreak. But it belongs to the artistic tradition that the plague created, a tradition in which death is not the dignified conclusion of a well-lived life but an indiscriminate force that arrives on horseback with arrows for everyone. That tradition would not have existed without 1348. The image of the triumphant skeleton, the death that does not discriminate, that cannot be appeased, that finds you wherever you are and takes you when it chooses, was the plague's gift to European art. What the poets saw. Francesco Petrarch lost his great love, Laura, to the plague in 1348. He had been writing sonnets to her for 20 years, the canzoniere, the sequence of poems that would define the European lyric tradition for the next 3 centuries, and then she was dead, and he kept writing. The sonnets he wrote after her death are different from the ones before it, more resigned, more aware of time's passing, more concerned with the specific texture of loss rather than the abstract ideal of they are, in the way of great poetry, more interesting. The plague made Petrarch a better poet. He would have preferred Laura. Petrarch's experience was not unique among the writers of his generation. Boccaccio lost friends and colleagues. William Langland, writing Piers Plowman in England in the 1360s and 1370s, wrote from within a society still processing the shock of the plague and its recurrences. Chaucer, slightly later, set his Canterbury Tales in a world where plague was a familiar feature of the landscape, where the physician was one of the pilgrims, where the pardoner sold indulgences to people terrified of sudden death. The literature of the post-plague generation is saturated with a specific awareness of mortality, not the abstract theological awareness that had always been present in medieval writing, but a personal, experienced awareness of what it meant to watch everyone you knew die in a few months. This shift in the emotional register of European literature, from the abstract to the specific, from the theological to the personal, from the symbolic to the observed, is one of the plague's most durable cultural legacies. The literature that followed the Black Death was literature written by people who had seen too much to be satisfied with conventional consolation, who had watched the conventional frameworks fail, and who were trying, with the only tools they had, to make sense of what was left. The results were, by any measure, some of the greatest writing in European history. The plague that killed so many of the writers also gave the survivors something necessary and terrible to say. The new beauty of death. The art and literature that the Black Death produced shared a quality that is, on reflection, surprising, beauty. The Danse Macabre murals are formally accomplished works with sophisticated compositions and complex iconographic programs. The Decameron is one of the most elegant prose works in Italian literature. The post-plague poetry of Petrarch and Chaucer is among the finest in their respective languages. The catastrophe that produced this work was not aesthetically ennobling in any simple sense, the suffering was real and the art did not redeem it. But the artists and writers who survived the catastrophe were artists and writers who had been, as the existentialists would later say, confronted with the radical truth of mortality, and that confrontation made their work different from anything that had come before. The specific beauty of post-plague art is the beauty of things that know they will end. The flowers in the margins of the illuminated manuscripts of the late 14th century are painted with a precision and care that suggests the illuminator knew, had reason to know, that flowers could be gone tomorrow. The faces of the dead in the plague paintings are individual faces, painted as if the painter wanted to insist on the specific personhood of each dead person, as if the anonymity of mass death had made individual recognition a moral obligation. The world that the Black Death made was a world that had been forced, in the most brutal possible way, to look at what it was made of. And the art that world produced, the art of endings, of mortality, of the specific weight of a specific human life, is the art that defined European culture for the century after the plague and that still speaks to audiences who have never heard of the Black Death and may not know what they are looking at when they encounter it. The skeleton still dances. The plague is still moving. The pages that John Clyn left blank are still blank. The beauty is inseparable from the terror, and neither is diminishable by the other. The Black Death is widely credited with accelerating the vernacular literary tradition, the literature written in French, English, Italian, and German rather than Latin. The destruction of the Latin literate clergy, combined with the rising economic and social status of the surviving merchant class, created both a reduced supply of readers who could access Latin literature and an increased supply of readers who wanted literature in their own languages. Boccaccio wrote in Italian. Chaucer wrote in Middle English. Langland wrote in Middle English. The vernacular tradition that would produce Shakespeare was built, in part, on the ruins of the Latin literate culture that the plague had partly destroyed. This is the uncomfortable arithmetic of catastrophe. The same event that killed the writers also created the conditions in which the survivors wrote differently, more personally, more urgently, more aware of the specific weight of a specific human life. We cannot know what the poets and painters who died in 1348 would have made. We know what the ones who survived made, and we call it the Renaissance. The plague that ended the medieval world also, in the most brutal possible way, began the modern one. Source: A Distant Mirror, The Calamitous 14th Century, Barbara Tuchman, 1978. Chapter 9. The Price of a Survivor. How the Plague Made Labor Expensive, Grain Cheap, and Everything Else Different, 1349 to 1400. The Market Nobody Planned. The market that emerged from the Black Death was not designed by anyone. No economist proposed it, no king decreed it, no philosopher advocated for it. It emerged from a single brute fact: half the workers were dead. Everything else followed from that. Wages rose because employers competed for scarce labor. Land prices fell because there was more of it than surviving farmers could use. Food prices dropped because fewer mouths needed feeding. The purchasing power of a surviving laborer in 1360 was, by most estimates, double what it had been for his father in 1340. The plague had accomplished, in months, what no reform movement had achieved in centuries. The English evidence is the most carefully documented. Manorial accounts, the records kept by the administrators of large estates, survive in large numbers and record, with the precision of men whose job depended on it, exactly what was paid for every task on the estate. Before the plague, a reaper hired for the harvest earned 2 pence a day. After the plague, 4 pence, 5 pence, sometimes 6. The lord who refused to pay the new rate watched his grain rot in the fields while his neighbor's reaper worked. The market did not care about tradition or obligation. It cared about who needed whom more. The city trades moved faster than the land. Urban craftsmen, the masons and carpenters and weavers and tanners whose skills had taken years to acquire, understood their leverage more quickly than agricultural labourers and used it more effectively. A master mason in London in 1360 was earning wages that had not been seen in the previous generation. He was also, in many cases, farming the property of a dead neighbor, eating better than his father had, and sending his son to a school that had previously served only the children of merchants. The Black Death did not create the English middle class. But it compressed into a decade changes that would otherwise have taken a century. Grain, land, and the inversion of everything. The inversion of the labor market was mirrored by an inversion of the land market. Before the plague, land in England and France had been scarce relative to the population that needed to farm it. Marginal land, the thin soils of hillsides, the waterlogged fields at the edges of river valleys, the heathland that had been put under the plough during the population expansion of the previous century, was farmed because it had to be. After the plague, none of it had to be. The population had contracted to a level that the best land could support without the marginal fields, and the marginal fields were simply abandoned. The abandonment is visible in the landscape of England today, though most people who look at it do not know what they are seeing. The ridge and furrow patterns that appear in aerial photographs of English farmland, the corrugated surface left by medieval stripfield cultivation, appear most prominently in fields that were abandoned in the late 14th century and never ploughed again. The grass that grew over them preserved the furrows. What looks like a decorative feature of the English countryside is a record of the moment when the people who had been farming those fields stopped existing. Grain prices fell steadily through the second half of the 14th century, not because harvests were bad but because there were fewer people to feed and more land available to grow food on. A bushel of wheat that had sold for £1 before the plague sold for 8p by 1380. For the surviving farmers, who were earning higher wages and paying lower rents, this meant a standard of living their grandparents would have found almost unimaginable. For the lords who had been living on rents and grain sales, it meant a financial crisis that no amount of political maneuvering could fully resolve. A case study: Alice Purras and the world she could not have existed in before. Alice Purras was the mistress of King Edward III of England in the last years of his reign, which ended in 1377. She was not of noble birth, her origins are disputed, but she was almost certainly the daughter of a minor craftsman or merchant, and the fact that she accumulated the wealth and influence she did, becoming one of the most powerful women in England and the target of repeated parliamentary attempts to remove her from the court, is itself evidence of something the plague had made possible. Before 1348, the social mobility that Alice Purras' career represented was not impossible, but it was rare enough that her story would have been exceptional by any measure. After 1348, the combination of labor scarcity, inheritance windfalls from dead relatives, and the loosening of the social rigidities that had kept non-noble families in their place created conditions in which a woman of her background could accumulate land, money, and influence on a scale that would previously have required noble birth. The market did not care about tradition or obligation. It cared about who needed whom more. The chroniclers who wrote about Alice Purris were almost uniformly hostile. She was described as grasping, manipulative, and of low birth, which in the 14th century was considered a self-evident disqualification for the position she occupied. What they were really objecting to was a woman who had used the specific conditions of the post-plague world to do something the pre-plague world would not have permitted. She died wealthy, having survived the political storms that swept away most of her enemies. Her story is a minor footnote in the history of Edward III court. It is also a precise measurement of what the plague had changed: the luxury trades and the new customers. The redistribution of wealth that the plague produced had effects that extended into every corner of the economy, including corners that had previously been reserved for the very rich. Before the plague, the luxury trades, the goldsmiths, the silk merchants, the makers of fine furniture and elaborate clothing, served a clientele that was almost exclusively noble or ecclesiastical. After the plague, they had new customers: the craftsmen and merchants and minor landowners who had survived to inherit the accumulated savings of their dead relatives, who were earning higher wages than any generation before them, and who had both the means and the desire to spend. The sumptuary laws that proliferated across Europe in the second half of the 14th century are a precise register of the ruling class's panic about this development. Sumptuary laws, regulations specifying what different classes of people were permitted to wear, eat, and display, had existed before the plague, but they multiplied after it, growing more detailed and more specific in their attempts to maintain the visible distinctions between social ranks that the redistribution of wealth was eroding. You could not actually prevent a prosperous craftsman from eating the same food as a knight if he could afford it. But you could, in theory, prevent him from wearing the same colors. The theory did not survive contact with reality. The sumptuary laws were widely ignored, frequently revised, and almost never effectively enforced. They are interesting not as evidence of successful social control but as evidence of anxiety of a ruling class watching the visible markers of its superiority dissolve and reaching for legal remedies that the market had already made obsolete. The world the plague made was a world in which wealth was being redistributed in ways that the wealthy could not stop, and they knew it. What prosperity felt like. The prosperity of the post-plague generation was real, documented, and accompanied by a psychological complexity that the wage records alone cannot capture. The surviving workers who were earning more and eating better were also living in houses that had been emptied by death, farming fields where their neighbors had died, marrying widows and widowers whose previous spouses had been killed by the same epidemic that had created the opportunities they were now enjoying. The prosperity was built on a foundation of loss that no one had chosen and no one could escape. The wills of the post-plague generation reveal this complexity. They are unusually generous in their charitable bequests, masses for the souls of the dead, donations to hospitals, endowments for prayers, in a way that suggests a population trying to discharge an obligation to those whose deaths had made their own improved circumstances possible. The penitential literature of the period is saturated with the sense that the survivors owed something to the dead, that the windfall of inheritance and improved wages was morally complicated in ways that straightforward prosperity is not. The plague generation knew, in a way that no subsequent generation fully shared, that the prosperity they were experiencing had a specific price and a specific origin. They had watched the price paid. They had collected the inheritance. The complexity of living well in the aftermath of mass death, the guilt, the gratitude, the determination to enjoy what remained because remaining was itself uncertain, is not something the wage records capture. But it runs through the literature and the art of the period like a watermark, visible when you hold the page up to the light. The Black Death's economic consequences were not uniform across Europe. In some regions, particularly in Eastern Europe, lords responded to the labor shortage not by competing for workers with higher wages but by legally binding peasants more firmly to the land, initiating the second serfdom that would persist in Poland, Bohemia, and Russia into the 19th century. The same demographic shock that produced labor freedom in England and France produced deeper enslavement in the East. The difference was not in the plague but in the political institutions that processed its consequences. Source: The Great Mortality, An Intimate History of the Black Death, John Kelly, 2005. Chapter 10. The Inheritance Nobody Asked For. Wealth, Property, and the Accidental Redistribution of Everything, 1348 to 1380. The wills that couldn't be written fast enough. In the spring of 1348, the notaries of Florence found themselves doing something they had never done before, running. Not physically, though some of them were certainly running from the plague, but professionally, overwhelmed by a demand for their services that exceeded anything the city had previously produced. Everyone who believed they were about to die wanted a will. Everyone who had been putting off the drafting of a will because there was time, because the matter could wait, because there was always tomorrow, they were all coming to the notaries at once, and many of them were already showing the first symptoms when they arrived. The surviving Florentine notarial registers from 1348 show the spike with brutal clarity. In a normal year, the number of wills filed in a given month was predictable, seasonal, the ordinary rhythm of a city managing the ordinary pace of death. In March and April of 1348, that number multiplied many times over. The registers bulge with the urgent, sometimes barely legible signatures of men and women who knew they might not be alive to review the document. And then, in May and June, the entries stop. Not because fewer people were dying, more were dying. Because the notaries had died too. The silence in the registers is shaped exactly like catastrophe. It is the administrative record of the moment when the institution designed to manage the transfer of property collapsed under the weight of the property being transferred. The wills that were never written, because the testator died before the notary arrived or the notary died before the testator finished speaking, represent a redistribution of property that followed not the wishes of the dead but the accident of who survived them. The windfall generation. Across Europe, in the months following the peak of the first epidemic, a transfer of property occurred on a scale that had no precedent in recorded history. The dead left behind houses, land, tools, livestock, saved coins, accumulated goods, the physical residue of lives that had been building toward futures that would never happen. This property passed, according to the laws of inheritance that varied by region and by the presence or absence of a valid will, to whoever was next in line, and in families that had lost most of their members, the next in line might be a distant cousin, a neighbor, a lord exercising his feudal rights over a tenant who had died without heirs. The secondary consequences of this redistribution were visible within years. Men who had been minor craftsmen became landowners. Women who had been the daughters of merchants became the heads of commercial enterprises. Children who had been born into circumstances that would have defined the entire trajectory of their lives found, on the death of parents and siblings and cousins, that the trajectory had changed completely. The social mobility that feudal society had been designed to prevent became, in the years after the plague, not exactly normal but far more common than it had ever been. Not all of this mobility was upward. The same redistribution that enriched some families impoverished others. Lords who lost tenants lost the income those tenants provided. Merchants who lost trading partners lost the commercial relationships that had made their businesses viable. The plague did not simply move wealth from one group to another, it dissolved the social structures within which wealth had meaning and forced the survivors to reconstruct those structures from scratch, with whatever pieces remained. A case study: the hospitals that inherited everything. The hospitals of medieval Europe, mostly run by religious orders, funded by charitable donations, and organized around the principle that caring for the sick poor was a Christian obligation, received, in the years after the Black Death, more property than they knew what to do with. Dying people with no surviving relatives left everything to the church, or to the hospital, or to the foundling home, or to whatever charitable institution seemed most likely to pray for their souls. The bequests accumulated to a degree that transformed some institutions from chronically underfunded operations into significant landowners. The Hospital of Santa Maria Nuova in Florence, founded in 1288, is a useful example. Before the plague, it operated on a combination of charitable donations and the income from a modest property portfolio. After the plague, the bequests of dying Florentines, people with no one left to leave their property to, or people who believed the hospital deserved it for the care it had provided to the dying, expanded its holdings dramatically. By the end of the 14th century, it was one of the larger landowners in the Florentine countryside, an institution that had grown wealthy precisely because it had spent the plague years surrounded by death. The plague rewarded presence and punished absence, and the people it rewarded were not always the people that any legal system would have chosen. The irony was not lost on contemporaries. The institutions whose purpose was to care for the dying had been enriched by the dying's gratitude, and that enrichment gave them the resources to build the hospitals, the wards, the pharmacies, and the medical schools that would eventually, centuries later, produce something approaching modern medicine. The Black Death funded, indirectly, through the bequests of its victims, some of the institutions that would eventually understand what had caused it. The Church's windfall and its consequences. The Catholic Church was the largest single beneficiary of the plague's redistribution of property, for reasons that were simultaneously theological and practical. Theologically, the dying wanted masses said for their souls, perpetual masses, chantry masses, anniversary masses, and endowing a priest to say masses required giving property to the church that would generate the income to pay the priest. Practically, the church was everywhere, it had the legal infrastructure to receive and manage property, and it was the most obvious institution to benefit from the charitable impulse of the dying. The scale of the church's property accumulation in the post-plague decades alarmed secular rulers who watched land and income flowing into ecclesiastical hands that paid no taxes and over which royal courts had limited jurisdiction. The legislation that various European monarchs passed in the second half of the 14th century attempting to limit mortmain, the transfer of property to the church in perpetuity, reflects a direct response to the flood of plague bequests. In England, the Statute of Mortmain of 1279 had already limited such transfers. The post-plague period saw its enforcement tightened and its scope extended as the Crown watched its tax base erode into ecclesiastical ownership. The Church's wealth also attracted the kind of scrutiny that wealth always attracts. The pre-plague Church had been rich and was criticized for it. The post-plague Church was richer, and the criticism intensified. John Wycliffe, writing in England in the 1370s and 1380s, made the Church's property one of the central targets of his reforming program, arguing that an institution that owned as much as the English Church owned had lost the moral authority to claim any spiritual leadership. His arguments found audiences that the pre-plague Church, less visibly wealthy and more institutionally coherent, would not have produced. The plague had made the Church rich and, in making it rich, had helped make the Reformation possible. The invisible transfer. Not all of the plague's property redistribution was visible in wills and bequests. Some of it happened invisibly, in the gap between what the law said and what the survivors could enforce. A peasant family that died without a will left its property technically subject to the lord's feudal rights, but if the lord was also dealing with the deaths of half his own household, his administrators were overwhelmed, and the neighboring family that quietly took over the dead family's strips in the open field was unlikely to face legal challenge for years, if ever. The legal chaos of the post-plague period produced a generation of disputed titles, contested inheritances, and unresolved property claims that kept the courts of England and France busy for decades. The court records of the late 14th century are full of cases that trace their origins to the plague years, property that had changed hands 3 times since 1348, each transfer contested by surviving relatives who had been absent during the crisis and returned to find their claims occupied by squatters with a decade of possession on their side. The invisible transfer matters because it was the mechanism by which some of the most significant social mobility of the post-plague period occurred. The people who benefited from it were not the people who received formal bequests, those were documented, contested, and subject to legal claims. The people who benefited from it were the ones who had been present, who had survived, who had quietly occupied what was left and built their lives on it before anyone was in a position to object. The plague rewarded presence and punished absence, and the people it rewarded were not always the people that any legal system, before or after, would have chosen. The Black Death's effect on inheritance patterns had a specific demographic consequence that took centuries to fully understand. It produced a temporary increase in the proportion of women who controlled significant property. In families where all the male heirs had died, female inheritance became the default, and the women who inherited in the plague years sometimes built commercial and agricultural enterprises that persisted for generations. The temporary feminization of property control in the post-plague period was one of the factors that contributed to the modest expansion of women's economic roles in the late 14th and early 15th centuries. Source: A Distant Mirror, The Calamitous 14th Century, Barbara Tuchman, 1978. Chapter 11. The Language the Plague Freed. Vernacular Literature, The Death of Latin, and the Birth of the Book, 1348 to 1420. The Scribes Who Didn't Come Back. The scriptorium at Bury St Edmunds in Suffolk was one of the great book-producing centres of medieval England. In the decades before the plague, its monks had been copying manuscripts at a pace that reflected both the demand for texts and the supply of trained hands, men who had spent years learning the particular discipline of the monastic scribe, the careful formation of each letter, the management of the quill and the parchment, the knowledge of when to stop for the day before fatigue introduced errors. When the plague arrived at Bury St Edmunds in 1349, it killed the majority of the monks. The scriptorium did not close immediately, but the pace of production slowed, the quality of the surviving work declined, and several projects begun before the plague were never finished. The story of Bury St Edmunds was repeated at monastic scriptoria across England and France and the Italian peninsula. The men who had been copying manuscripts died. The novices who might have replaced them died. The masters who would have trained new novices died. What emerged from this was not simply a shortage of manuscripts, though there was that, but a change in who was producing them and for whom. The Latin manuscript culture of the medieval church, which had been the primary vehicle for the transmission of ideas across Europe, was damaged in ways that it never fully repaired. Into the gap came something else. The vernacular, the living languages that people actually spoke, the French of northern France and the Italian of the city-states and the English of England had been producing literature before the plague. But vernacular literature had been secondary, supplementary, something that existed alongside the Latin tradition rather than in competition with it. After the plague, with the Latin literate clergy depleted and the literate lay audience expanded by prosperity and by the schools that were training more readers than the pre-plague church had been producing, the vernacular moved from the margin to the center. Boccaccio's choice. Giovanni Boccaccio had the education to write in Latin. He had studied it, worked in it, and could have produced the kind of learned Latin prose that would have found readers in every monastery and university in Europe. He chose to write the Decameron in Italian. He chose to write it in Italian specifically so that it could be read by the kind of women he was addressing in his preface, women who, unlike the clerically educated men who read Latin, were literate only in their vernacular language. The choice was not apologetic. It was strategic. He wanted readers that Latin could not reach. The Decameron was finished in the early 1350s and was copied and distributed with a speed that suggests immediate demand. It was not an official production, it circulated in private copies, passed between readers who copied it by hand or had it copied for them, and this unofficial circulation was itself evidence of a reading public that the pre-plague world had not quite produced in this form: urban, literate, not necessarily university educated, interested in stories that engaged with the actual texture of their lives rather than the theological allegories of the Latin tradition. Boccaccio spent some of the rest of his career feeling guilty about the Decameron, worrying that its frankness was incompatible with the piety he also felt. This guilt produced some of his less interesting later work. But the Decameron itself did not feel guilty. It felt alive, in the specific way that literature feels alive when it is written by a person who has survived something enormous and is trying to put the experience into words that other survivors can recognize. A case study: Chaucer's Pilgrims and the world they walked through. Geoffrey Chaucer was born sometime around 1343, which means he was roughly 5 years old when the Black Death arrived in England and perhaps 12 or 13 during the second outbreak of 1361. He did not write directly about the plague. The Canterbury Tales, his masterwork, does not have a plague chapter, but it is saturated with the world the plague had made. The social mix of his pilgrims, the knight and the miller, the prioress and the wife of Bath, the pardoner selling plague indulgences, is specifically the social mix of the post-plague world, in which the old hierarchies were visibly fraying and the new ones had not yet solidified. The wife of Bath is, in some ways, the plague's most vivid literary creation. She is a clothmaker from Bath, a woman of substantial means who has been married 5 times and is entirely comfortable asserting her own desires and her own authority in a language and a form, the vernacular tale, that the pre-plague world would have considered unsuitable for someone of her class and gender. She could not have existed in the same literary form before 1348. She requires the vernacular tradition, the expanded reading public, the loosening of social norms that made it possible for a clothmaker's widow to be a subject of serious literary attention. The urgency with which Renaissance culture pursued beauty, learning, and achievement was the urgency of people who understood that they might not have tomorrow. The pardoner, meanwhile, is selling letters of indulgence, official documents from the church certifying the forgiveness of sins, to pilgrims who are terrified of sudden death and who have watched the institutional church fail to protect anyone from it. His trade is a precise exploitation of the theological crisis that the plague had created. A population that had lost faith in the church's ability to protect them in life was particularly susceptible to paying for the church's promises of protection after death. Chaucer gives him, in the tale he tells, a story that is both brilliant and damning, a performance of cynicism by a man who knows he is selling something he does not believe in to people who know it too but cannot afford to admit it. The vernacular and the book. The shift toward vernacular literature coincided with, and was accelerated by, a series of developments in the production and distribution of books that the plague's economic consequences had helped create. The prosperity of the post-plague artisan and merchant class produced a market for books that had not previously existed on this scale. Books in the vernacular, books that could be read by people who had learned to read in their native language but had not studied Latin, were what that market wanted. The commercial book trade that developed in the major European cities in the late 14th and early 15th centuries was something qualitatively new. Books were being produced not in monastic scriptoria by monks who regarded bookmaking as a form of prayer but in commercial workshops by paid craftsmen who regarded it as a business. The illuminators, the scribes, the binders, the sellers all were now working in a market that set prices and quality according to demand rather than according to the requirements of a religious community. The books that resulted were often less beautiful than the great monastic productions of the pre-plague period. They were also more numerous, more varied, and more widely distributed. Gutenberg's printing press, which arrived in the 1450s about a century after the Black Death, is often treated as the beginning of the book revolution. It was, in important respects, the culmination of one that had already begun. The market that Gutenberg's press would serve, the literate lay audience that wanted cheap access to texts in their own languages, was a market that the plague had helped create by killing the Latin literate clergy and enriching the vernacular literate laity. The press did not create the demand. The demand was waiting. The language that survived. The vernacular languages that emerged from the post-plague period as literary vehicles were not the same languages that had entered it. English, in particular, underwent in the second half of the 14th century the kind of rapid change and creative elaboration that languages undergo when they are suddenly called upon to do things they have not done before, to carry the weight of serious literature, complex argument, and extended narrative in forms that had previously been reserved for Latin. The English that Chaucer wrote was a richer, more flexible, more capacious language than the English of the generation before the plague, partly because it had been absorbing French vocabulary for 3 centuries since the Norman conquest, and partly because the particular pressure of the post-plague moment, the need to produce literature for a literate lay audience that wanted serious engagement with the serious questions the plague had raised, had accelerated that development. The language was being stretched to do new things, and it was responding. The Italian that Boccaccio and Petrarch and Dante before them had been developing into a literary language was similarly transformed by the post-plague pressure. The vernacular that would eventually become the dominant cultural language of the Renaissance, the language in which Machiavelli would write about power and Leonardo would write about painting, was shaped in significant part by the experience of the generation that survived 1348 and tried to make sense of it in words that other survivors could recognize. The plague did not give Europe its modern languages, but it gave those languages their first great test, and the languages passed it. The Black Death's destruction of the Latin literate clergy created, somewhat paradoxically, an increased demand for education, specifically, for the grammar schools that taught Latin to the children who would fill the depleted ranks of the clergy. The expansion of the grammar school system in England in the late 14th and early 15th centuries was partly a response to the plague's destruction of the educated class, and the boys who passed through those schools in the generations after the plague included many who would go on to produce the vernacular literature of the 15th century. The plague that killed the scribes also funded the schools that trained their replacements. Source: A Distant Mirror, The Calamitous 14th Century, Barbara Tuchman, 1978. Chapter 12. The Invention of Quarantine. Venice, the Lazaretto, and the Birth of Public Health, 1347 to 1424. The city that counted its dead. Venice in 1347 was the most sophisticated administrative machine in Europe. It had a senate, a council of 10, a doge, a bureaucracy of professional administrators who kept records, followed procedures, and enforced regulations with a consistency that most medieval governments could only aspire to. When the plague arrived in October 1347, the Venetian government did something that no other European government had thought to do: it counted. It appointed 3 noblemen to superintend and govern the matter of persons dying of the epidemic, and it instructed them to keep records. The records they kept are among the most valuable epidemiological documents of the 14th century. They show, week by week, the progression of the epidemic through the city, the deaths by district, by age, by sex, the fluctuations that suggest the disease's seasonal patterns and the specific geography of its spread. Venice was not trying to do epidemiology in the modern sense. The men counting the dead had no germ theory, no understanding of transmission, no analytical framework that would let them act effectively on what they were recording. But they were counting, and counting was a beginning. The Venetian government's instinct to count and record in the face of catastrophe was the instinct of an institution that had been built on information, on trade records, on diplomatic dispatches, on the systematic collection of knowledge about the world that commerce required. It was also the instinct that would, over the following century, produce the most significant public health innovation of the medieval period: the quarantine. In 1374, Venice issued a decree that changed the history of medicine. Ships arriving from plague-infected ports were required to anchor offshore for 30 days before their passengers and cargo could come ashore. 30 days, Trentino in Italian, was the period that the Venetian authorities calculated was long enough to determine whether incoming travelers were infected. The sick would show symptoms and die within that window. The healthy would remain healthy. The city would be protected. The 30-day period was extended to 40 days, quarantina, in subsequent regulations, and the word quarantine entered the European languages from the Venetian practice. The medical reasoning behind the number was wrong. Plague's incubation period is 3 to 7 days, not 40, and a 40-day isolation of plague victims would have produced mostly dead quarantined people rather than the living ones who could be safely admitted. But the principle that isolating new arrivals for a defined period could interrupt disease transmission was correct in ways that exceeded the understanding of those who implemented it. The quarantine was not immediately adopted everywhere, and where it was adopted it was inconsistently enforced. The commercial pressures against it were enormous. Every day a merchant's ship sat at anchor offshore was a day of spoiling cargo and mounting costs, and the merchants who suffered those costs lobbied against the regulations as vigorously as any modern industry lobbies against safety standards that cut into profit. The history of quarantine is, in large part, the history of commerce and public health in permanent conflict, a conflict that the 14th century invented and that has never been fully resolved. A case study: the Lazaretto of Venice. In 1423, Venice took the next logical step. If ships had to wait offshore before entering the city, the sick and their goods needed somewhere to go during that waiting period, somewhere that was not the city itself. The Venetian government acquired a small island in the lagoon, Santa Maria di Nazareth, and converted it into the world's first purpose-built quarantine facility, the Lazaretto Vecchio, named after Lazarus, the patron saint of lepers. The Lazaretto Vecchio was not a hospital in the modern sense. It was a holding facility, a place where suspected cases were isolated, where the goods of arriving ships were fumigated or stored, where the officials who managed the quarantine lived during their terms of service. The conditions were probably grim. The isolation was enforced rather than therapeutic. People who arrived sick at the lazaretto almost certainly died there, without the care that a proper hospital might have provided. But the institution existed, it functioned, and it embodied a principle that was more important than any of its specific inadequacies, that the state had a responsibility to protect its population from epidemic disease by isolating the potentially infected. The principle that public health trumped social hierarchy was established in the 14th century. Its consistent application has been a work in progress ever since. The lazaretto model spread. By the 15th and 16th centuries, most major Mediterranean port cities had established their own quarantine facilities, modeled on the Venetian original. The institutional infrastructure of public health, the quarantine officer, the health board, the official inspection of incoming ships, the records of illness and death was being assembled, piece by piece, in the aftermath of the Black Death, by governments that had watched the plague arrive and were determined, however imperfectly, to slow its return. The health board and what it meant. The Venetian health board that oversaw the quarantine arrangements was, in its basic form, one of the earliest public health bureaucracies in European history. It was staffed by officials who were appointed, paid, and accountable to the state rather than to the church. It collected information about disease patterns, regulated the activities of medical practitioners, and enforced rules that applied to everyone entering the city regardless of their social status. A Venetian nobleman returning from a plague-infected port waited in quarantine alongside a sailor and a merchant, because the health board's jurisdiction recognized only the biological categories of sick and well, not the social categories of noble and common. The bureaucratic equality of the health board, its indifference to social rank in the enforcement of public health rules, was, in the context of medieval Europe, genuinely radical. The institutions of medieval government had been built around social hierarchy. Their authority was expressed through the hierarchical relationships of lords and vassals, bishops and priests, masters and servants. An institution that imposed the same rules on everyone regardless of rank, and that justified those rules by appeal not to divine authority but to empirical observation of disease patterns, was something qualitatively new. It was also, in practice, something that the wealthy frequently managed to evade. The records of the Venetian Health Board include numerous cases of merchants and noblemen who paid bribes, pulled connections, or simply ignored the quarantine requirements, and who sometimes paid for their evasions by dying, and sometimes did not. The principle that public health trumped social hierarchy was established in the 14th century. Its consistent application has been a work in progress ever since. The long road to germ theory. The quarantine that Venice invented in the 14th century worked better than it had any right to, given that the people who designed it had no idea what they were trying to stop. They were trying to stop something they called pestilential air, the miasma theory again, the bad air that carried disease. What they were actually stopping, without knowing it, was the movement of rats and fleas on ships. The 40-day quarantine was long enough, in many cases, for the rats on a plague ship to die and the fleas to lose their hosts and disperse, reducing though not eliminating the risk of transmission. The practical success of quarantine measures that were theoretically wrong about their mechanism is one of the more interesting features of the history of medicine. The institutions that the Black Death prompted European governments to build, the quarantine stations, the health boards, the systematic recording of mortality, were effective tools for a problem that was not understood. They worked because the behaviors they regulated, the movement of people, goods, and the ships that carried both, happened to correspond to the actual mechanism of transmission, even though no one knew that was why they worked. The germ theory that eventually explained quarantine's effectiveness arrived in the 19th century, 500 years after Venice's first experiments. By that point, the institutional infrastructure of public health had been accumulating for centuries, built on foundations that the Black Death had forced into existence. The plague that killed 1 in 3 Europeans also, in the most unintended and most roundabout way imaginable, produced the institutions that would eventually, centuries later, understand what had caused it and how to prevent its return. The island of Lazaretto Vecchio in the Venetian lagoon was rediscovered by archaeologists in the 1990s. Excavations revealed the mass graves of plague victims who had died in the quarantine facility, along with the physical remains of the buildings that housed the quarantine operations. The skeletons showed the characteristic bone changes associated with Yersinia pestis infection, and DNA analysis confirmed the plague diagnosis. The first quarantine facility in history was also one of the first sites where modern science confirmed, in physical remains, what the medieval records had described. Source: Plagues and Peoples, William McNeill, 1976. Chapter 13. The Return of the Dead. Plague's Persistence and the Slow Recovery, 1361 to 1665. The Second Wave. The survivors of 1348 who allowed themselves to hope that the worst was over were proved wrong within a decade. In 1361, the plague returned. It arrived in England in the spring, moved through the country with the now familiar speed, and killed a proportion of the population that was, by some estimates, nearly as large as the first outbreak, perhaps 20% of those who remained. The chroniclers who recorded it called it the pestis puerorum, the plague of children, because it seemed to strike the young disproportionately. This was not random. The children of the plague generation had been born after 1348 to parents who had survived the first epidemic and who may have carried some partial immunity. The children themselves had no such immunity. They died in numbers that made 1361 feel, in some communities, as devastating as 1347 had been. The pestis puerorum of 1361 was followed by further outbreaks in 1369, 1374, 1382, and then with increasing frequency through the remainder of the 14th and into the 15th century. Yersinia pestis had established itself in the rodent populations of Europe after 1347 and was not going to leave. The question was not whether it would return but when and where and how severely. The plague became, for the next 3 centuries, what cancer or heart disease is today, an ever-present background risk that shaped behavior, that drove institutional responses, that informed the practical calculations of ordinary life. The psychology of living with recurring plague is difficult to reconstruct precisely because its effects were cumulative and gradual rather than dramatic and sudden. The great chroniclers who described the first outbreak in vivid detail had fewer successors for the subsequent ones, partly because many of the chroniclers had died, and partly because the second and third and fourth epidemics were, in the minds of those who lived through them, variations on a theme rather than a new event. The horror had already been registered. What followed was endurance. The demography of recovery. Europe's population in 1400 was roughly half what it had been in 1340. In 1450, it was still below pre-plague levels. In 1500, still below. The demographic recovery that the simple mathematics of reproduction would suggest should have been possible if the survivors had children, and their children had children, the population should have recovered within 2 or 3 generations, was repeatedly interrupted by the returning plague. Each outbreak killed populations that had not fully recovered from the previous one, resetting the clock on recovery and maintaining, for a century and a half after the first epidemic, a level of mortality that no European generation before or since has sustained. The demographic trough of the late 14th and early 15th centuries shaped European civilization in ways that the straightforward count of the dead does not capture. A Europe with half its pre-plague population was a Europe with half its pre-plague agricultural output, half its pre-plague manufacturing capacity, half its pre-plague intellectual production. But it was also a Europe in which the surviving half lived better than their ancestors had, better fed, better housed, better paid, because the resources that had previously supported twice as many people were now supporting half as many. The paradox of the post-plague world is that it was simultaneously a world of diminished collective capacity and expanded individual prosperity. The relationship between these two facts, the diminished collective and the expanded individual, drove the specific character of European development in the century after the plague. The great collective enterprises of the pre-plague period, the cathedrals, the crusades, the systematic reclamation of agricultural land, the expansion of urban populations, slowed or stopped. The individual enterprises, the flowering of vernacular literature, the development of commercial capitalism, the emergence of the humanist tradition, accelerated. The plague had broken the medieval collectivism and replaced it with something more individualistic, more focused on the person and the present, less organized around the grand collective projects of the church and the feudal state. The doctors learned to recognize it. By the middle of the 15th century, the physicians of Europe had acquired something they had not had in 1348, a body of clinical experience with the plague that allowed them to recognize it, describe it, and distinguish it from other fevers and epidemic diseases with some precision. They still could not treat it effectively. The theoretical framework of humoral medicine remained, and the treatments it prescribed remained ineffective, but they could identify it reliably, which meant that the public health responses could be triggered more quickly and applied more accurately. The plague treatises that multiplied after the first epidemic, written by physicians who had observed the disease and were trying to codify their observations for colleagues, are one of the first examples of systematic medical literature based on clinical experience rather than on the authority of ancient texts. They describe the symptoms, the progression, the variations between bubonic and pneumonic forms, the differential mortality in different populations, the effectiveness and ineffectiveness of various treatments. They are often wrong in their theoretical explanations and often right in their practical observations. They are the beginning of evidence-based medicine, born from the specific catastrophe of watching a disease that the existing theory could not explain. The Black Death was not an event. It was a condition. And the world it made was made not just by the dying of 1347 but by all the dying that followed. The recognition of plague as a specific disease entity distinct from other fevers, with its own characteristic presentation, its own epidemiological pattern, its own relationship to trade routes and urban density, was itself a medical advance. It meant that the quarantine institutions that Venice had built could be applied more precisely, that health boards could distinguish between threats that required quarantine responses and threats that did not, that the mechanisms of public health could become, gradually and imperfectly, more effective. When it ended, and why? The plague's last great epidemic in Western Europe was the London outbreak of 1665, which killed perhaps 100,000 people and was followed by the Great Fire of 1666, an event that, by destroying the old rat-infested housing of the medieval city, may have contributed to the subsequent absence of plague from London, though the real reasons for the plague's disappearance from Western Europe after the 1660s remain debated. The fact is clear: after centuries of recurrence, the plague simply retreated from Western Europe without a clear explanation that satisfies all historians. Several theories have been proposed. The black rat, which harbored the fleas that carried Yersinia pestis, may have been displaced in European cities by the brown rat, which has different flea associations and different behaviors. The specific strains of the bacterium circulating in Europe may have evolved toward lower virulence. The human immune systems of the European population, after 3 centuries of selection pressure, may have developed increased resistance. Climate changes may have affected the rodent reservoir populations that maintained the bacterium between epidemics. None of these explanations is fully satisfying, and the plague's retreat remains one of the more interesting unsolved questions in the history of epidemics. What is certain is that when the plague retreated from Western Europe in the 1660s, it left behind a civilization that had been shaped by its presence for 3 centuries in ways that the civilization itself did not fully understand. The labor markets, the property regimes, the religious landscape, the literary languages, the public health institutions, the personal psychology of a population that had lived for generations with the knowledge that sudden death was always possible, all of these had been formed, in ways large and small, by the experience of living in the plague's shadow. The world the plague made did not end when the plague ended. It was the world that early modernity inherited, and that inheritance has not been fully spent. The Great Plague of London in 1665 killed approximately 100,000 people, roughly a quarter of the city's population, in about 8 months. Samuel Pepys, whose diary provides the most vivid contemporary account of the epidemic, recorded his own attempts to conduct his daily life in a city that was visibly dying around him, noting deaths among his acquaintances, observing the shuttered houses with red crosses painted on their doors, and, with the particular honesty that makes his diary one of the great documents of the period, recording his own terror and his own attempts to manage it through work and distraction and the occasional glass of wine. Source: The Great Mortality, An Intimate History of the Black Death, John Kelly, 2005. Chapter 14. The Renaissance Nobody Credits the Plague for. How the Black Death Planted the Seeds of Humanism, 1350 to 1500. The wrong explanation. The Renaissance has many origin stories, and almost none of them mention the plague. The standard account emphasizes the rediscovery of classical texts, the patronage of the Medici, the genius of individual artists and thinkers, the revival of Greek philosophy, all of which are real and important. What this account leaves out is the specific intellectual atmosphere that the Black Death created, a civilization-wide experience of institutional failure, of the collapse of the frameworks that had given medieval life its meaning, and of the survivors' need to reconstruct meaning from scratch. The Renaissance did not emerge despite the Black Death. In important ways, it could not have emerged without it. The connection is not simple causation. The plague did not cause humanism in the way that a falling stone causes a bruise. It is more that the plague created the conditions in which certain intellectual tendencies that had been marginal before 1348 could become central. A focus on the individual rather than the collective, on this life rather than the next, on direct observation rather than received authority, on the human capacity to understand and shape the world rather than simply to accept what God had ordained. These tendencies existed before 1348. They had existed in fragments, in marginal notes, in the work of individual thinkers who were ahead of their time. The plague cleared space for them in a way that no amount of intellectual argument could have done. The clearest evidence for the connection is chronological. The great humanist projects of the Italian Renaissance, Petrarca's recovery of classical texts, Boccaccio's vernacular innovation, the Florentine Platonic Academy, the political philosophy of the city-states all took their decisive forms in the second half of the 14th century and the first half of the 15th, in the generations immediately following the Black Death. This timing is not coincidental. Petrarch and the Hinge. Francesco Petrarch is often called the first Renaissance man, and the label is accurate enough if you understand what it means. He was the first major European thinker for whom the classical past was not simply a repository of authority to be cited in support of existing beliefs, but a living alternative to the present, a world that had organized human life differently, that had valued different things, that could serve as a standard of comparison and, implicitly, of criticism. His engagement with Cicero, with Virgil, with the Roman historians was the engagement of a man who found in them what his own present could not provide, a vision of human life as something worth living for its own sake. Petrarch had begun his classical scholarship before the plague. But the plague gave it a new urgency. The Laura he had been writing sonnets to for 2 decades was dead. The institutional church that had been the organizing structure of medieval intellectual life had been visibly discredited. The frameworks that had made the medieval present feel stable and meaningful had been exposed as inadequate. What Petrarch found in the classical past, a secular seriousness about human experience, a commitment to the cultivation of the individual mind and character, an insistence that this life, in this world, had value, was precisely what the post-plague present seemed to need. The Petrarchan vision of classical antiquity was not historically accurate. He idealized Rome in ways that Roman historians would have found puzzling, but it was intellectually productive. It gave the post-plague generation a framework for thinking about human life that did not depend on the institutions that had failed them. It said, "Here is how people have thought about being human before," and it was enough. We can learn from it. We can build from it. We are not simply waiting for death and resurrection. We are here, and that matters. A case study: the founding of the Florentine hospital system. Among the practical consequences of the Black Death in Florence was a massive expansion of charitable institutions, hospitals, orphanages, foundling homes funded by the bequests of plague victims and operated by a new generation of lay administrators who were not clergy. The Ospedale degli Innocenti, the famous foundling hospital that Brunelleschi designed in the 1420s, is the most beautiful example. It was not a church institution. It was funded by the Silk Guild and governed by lay trustees, and its architecture, the classical arcade, the rational proportions, the integration of beauty and function, embodied the humanist values that the post-plague generation was developing. The founding of these institutions mattered not just because they cared for the sick and the abandoned. They mattered because they created new roles for lay people in the governance of public welfare roles that had previously been monopolized by the clergy. The men who served as administrators of the Florentine hospitals were developing, in practice, the skills of civic governance that humanist political philosophy would theorize in the same period. The idea that the city was a human project that its citizens were responsible for managing, not a divine creation that the church was responsible for overseeing. The Renaissance that the plague helped produce was both a celebration and an elegy, a celebration of what human beings could make, and an elegy for all who had not survived. The architectural beauty of the Ospedale degli Innocenti is sometimes attributed entirely to Brunelleschi's genius, and his genius was real. But the institution it housed, and the social vision that funded and governed it, was itself a product of the world the plague had made. A pre-plague Florence would not have built that building, not because Brunelleschi would not have designed it, but because no one would have understood what it was for. The plague created the charitable impulse that funded it, the civic institutions that governed it, and the humanist values that gave it its specific architectural form. Individualism and its price. The individualism that the Renaissance produced, the focus on the unique person, the singular genius, the unprecedented achievement, is sometimes celebrated as a straightforward liberation from the collectivism of the medieval world. It was also, in part, a response to trauma. The medieval collectivism that it replaced had been the collectivism of a world in which the individual derived meaning from membership in a community, a family, a guild, a parish, a monastic order. The plague had destroyed those communities by killing their members, and the survivors were left to construct meaning in a world where the old communities were gone or depleted. The humanist emphasis on individual cultivation, on the development of personal virtue and learning as ends in themselves, was partly a response to this dissolution of community, a way of locating meaning in the person when the institutions that had previously provided meaning had failed. But it was an incomplete response, because individuals who locate meaning entirely in themselves eventually need to locate it in relation to something larger, and the Renaissance never quite solved the problem of what that something larger should be if it was not the Church. The Reformation, when it came in the 16th century, was in part an attempt to solve that problem, to reconstruct a community of meaning from the individual's direct relationship with God, bypassing the institutional church that had failed. The humanism that the plague helped produce and the Reformation that followed it are not separate movements. They are successive attempts by a civilization that had been through catastrophe to reconstruct the frameworks of meaning that catastrophe had destroyed. The plague set the problem. The Renaissance and the Reformation were the attempts to solve it. What the Renaissance knew about death. The Renaissance is most famous for its celebration of life, the paintings of the human body in its beauty and vitality, the literature of love and adventure and political glory, the architecture of rational order and civic magnificence. What is less often noted is that Renaissance culture was saturated with death. The memento mori, the skull on the scholar's desk, the dancing skeleton in the margin of the illuminated manuscript, was not a medieval holdover that the Renaissance failed to shake. It was a central preoccupation of a culture that had lived with mass death for a century and that had incorporated the awareness of mortality into its most fundamental assumptions about how life should be lived. The Renaissance doctrine of carpe diem, seize the day, because the day may be your last, was not simply a literary convention borrowed from Horace. It was an existential response to 3 generations of experience in which the day genuinely had been anyone's last. The people who built the Renaissance knew what sudden death looked like. They had watched it arrive in their cities without warning, claim their families without ceremony, and recede without explanation. The urgency with which Renaissance culture pursued beauty, learning, and achievement was the urgency of people who understood that they might not have tomorrow. The Renaissance that the plague helped produce was, in this sense, both a celebration and an elegy, a celebration of what human beings could make and know and be, and an elegy for all the human beings who had not survived to make it. The beauty of Renaissance art is partly the beauty of things made by people who knew that beauty was not guaranteed, that the world could turn dark without warning, and that the making itself was the only answer that uncertainty permitted. Giorgio Vasari, who wrote the lives of the artists in the 16th century and thereby invented the history of art as a discipline, organized his book around the concept of the Renaissance as a rebirth, a revival of the classical past after the dark ages of the medieval period. His framework, which is still influential, has been criticized by historians who point out that the medieval period was not dark and that the Renaissance was not a simple revival of the classical. What Vasari's framework misses, among other things, is the role of the Black Death in creating the conditions for the cultural transformation he describes. The rebirth he celebrated was seeded, in part, in the catastrophe he ignored. Source: A Distant Mirror, The Calamitous 14th Century, Barbara Tuchman, 1978. Chapter 15. The Mirror That Doesn't Lie. The Black Death in the Age of COVID and What We Learned from Each Other, 1347 to 2020. What was the same? The social fractures that COVID revealed, the differential mortality between the wealthy and the poor, the essential workers and the remote workers, the racially privileged and the racially disadvantaged, echoed with remarkable precision the social fractures that the Black Death had exposed. In both cases, the epidemic was nominally indiscriminate but practically differential. The people who could not stay home died more often than those who could. The people who lived in crowded housing died more often than those with space. The people who could afford good nutrition and medical care survived at higher rates than those who could not. The institutional failures were also recognizable. In 2020, as in 1348, the institutions that existed to manage public health were caught inadequately prepared for the specific nature of the crisis they faced. The global health infrastructure that had been built over the previous century, the World Health Organization, the National Centers for Disease Control, the pharmaceutical supply chains, was revealed, under pressure, to be less robust than it had appeared. The response was improvised, inconsistent, and unevenly distributed. The parallels with the institutional failures of 1348 were not exact, but they were close enough to be uncomfortable. The psychological responses were the most consistent. The denial in the early days, when the evidence was clear but the implications were not yet processed. The magical thinking that proposed specific cures, bleach and ultraviolet light in 2020, theriac and unicorn horn in 1348, that bore the same relationship to the actual disease in both cases, which was none. The search for someone responsible, someone whose malice or incompetence could be blamed for what was happening. The exhaustion that set in after the first acute phase, when the crisis had gone on long enough to feel permanent and the emergency measures had become a grinding new normal. A case study, the mask. In the summer of 2020, a debate erupted across the United States and Europe about whether healthy people should wear face masks in public. The debate was, on its surface, about evidence. Did masks reduce transmission of the coronavirus, and if so, by how much? Underneath the surface, it was about something older, the specific human difficulty of accepting an invisible threat, of taking a precaution that was visible but whose effects were not, of submitting to a collective discipline that limited individual freedom in service of a collective benefit. Medieval people had worn masks during plague epidemics, the beak-shaped masks of the plague doctor, stuffed with aromatic herbs, designed to filter the miasmatic air that was believed to cause the disease. The masks did not work against bubonic plague, which was transmitted by fleas rather than by air. They may have provided some protection against the pneumonic form, which was airborne. They certainly provided a measure of psychological comfort, the sense of doing something, of taking a precaution, of not simply waiting passively for death to arrive. The mask debate of 2020 was not about the same thing as the plague doctor's beak. The evidence for mask efficacy against respiratory viruses was real, contested in its specifics but not in its general direction. But the emotional register was recognizable, the resistance to visible precaution, the insistence on individual judgment over collective mandate, the suspicion that the measure was less about protection than about control. 7 centuries of distance had not changed the fundamental human response to being asked to alter visible behavior in response to an invisible threat. What was different? The differences between the Black Death and COVID are, in retrospect, as important as the similarities, and the most important difference was the speed of the scientific response. In 1348, the medical faculty of Paris took weeks to produce a report attributing the plague to planetary conjunction. In 2020, the genome of the SARS-CoV-2 virus was sequenced and published within days of the first cases being reported, shared openly with scientists around the world before the name COVID-19 had been coined. The vaccines that followed were developed in less than a year. The contrast with the 3 centuries that elapsed between the Black Death and the germ theory that explained it is not simply a measure of scientific progress. It is a measure of the cumulative effect of every institutional innovation that the plague had helped prompt. The public health infrastructure that responded to COVID, the epidemiological surveillance systems, the quarantine protocols, the contact tracing methods, the health boards with authority to impose movement restrictions, traced its institutional lineage directly to the responses that medieval Venice and Florence had improvised in 1347 and 1348. The tools were immeasurably more sophisticated. The underlying logic that a state had a responsibility to protect its population from epidemic disease by interrupting transmission was the same logic that Venice had articulated when it first required ships to anchor offshore for 30 days. The gap between what we know and what we do, between the evidence and the response, is a gap that no amount of scientific progress has fully closed. The mortality figures tell the story most clearly. COVID, in its first 2 years, killed approximately 6 million people globally, out of a global population of 8 billion, a mortality rate of roughly 0.075%. The Black Death killed between 75 and 200 million people, out of a global population of roughly 400 million, a mortality rate of perhaps 30 to 50%. The difference between 0.075% and 40% is the difference that science made. Not the science of 2020 alone, but the cumulative science of the 7 centuries since a Mongol army catapulted its dead over the walls of Kaffa. The lesson that keeps needing to be learned. Every epidemic teaches the same lesson, and every generation is surprised by it. The lesson is that infectious disease does not respect the categories that human societies create, the categories of rich and poor, deserving and undeserving, us and them. It moves through populations by the roots of human contact, and human contact follows the roots of commerce, of family, of the ordinary social life of communities. To stop an epidemic is to interrupt those roots, and interrupting those roots costs something, costs in commerce, in social life, in the ordinary freedoms that communities take for granted. Every generation discovers, under epidemic pressure, that it is less willing to pay those costs than it believed it would be. The Black Death was not the last epidemic to teach this lesson. It was the most dramatic. The subsequent outbreaks of plague, the influenza pandemic of 1918, the HIV epidemic, COVID-19 each taught it again, in a different idiom, to a generation that had not personally experienced the previous lesson. The institutional memory of epidemic response is real but imperfect. The health boards that Venice built in the 14th century eventually evolved into the WHO, but the WHO of 2020 was operating in a political environment that the Venetian Health Board could not have imagined, and that significantly limited its effectiveness. The Black Death's most durable legacy may be this: the knowledge that epidemic disease is a permanent feature of human existence, that it will return in forms we do not expect, that our institutions for managing it are always somewhat inadequate, and that the gap between what we know and what we do, between the evidence and the response, is a gap that no amount of scientific progress has fully closed. The plague is over. The lesson is not. The COVID-19 pandemic produced, among its other effects, a surge of interest in the history of epidemics, and specifically in the Black Death. John Kelly's The Great Mortality, Barbara Tuchman's A Distant Mirror, and other histories of medieval plague saw significant increases in sales and readership in 2020 and 2021, as readers who were living through a pandemic for the first time reached for accounts of how previous generations had survived similar experiences. The most common reader response, reported in reviews and reading groups, was a mixture of recognition and relief, recognition of the familiar patterns, and relief that the mortality rates were so much lower this time. Source: Plagues and Peoples, William McNeill, 1976. Chapter 16. What the Plague Left Behind. The World the Black Death Made and the World We Inherited from It. The Accounting. 7 centuries after Janibeg Khan loaded his catapults at Kaffa, the world the Black Death made is still the world we live in. Not directly, not simply, not in ways that a straight line could connect, but in the sense that the specific disruptions of 1347 to 1353, and the adaptations they forced, and the institutions those adaptations produced, and the ideas those institutions generated, contributed to making the world of the 15th century, which made the world of the 16th, which made the world of the 17th, and so on down to us. History works like that. It is made of contingencies that compound. The accounting is not triumphalist. The Black Death killed between 75 and 200 million people. It destroyed communities that had taken centuries to build. It killed children who would have grown into the scientists, artists, and statesmen that their generations did not have. It inflicted suffering on a scale that no subsequent event in European history, not the 30 Years' War, not the Napoleonic Wars, not the First World War, has matched as a proportion of the affected population. Any accounting of what the plague produced that does not start with this reckoning is falsifying the record. But the accounting also includes what the plague, in the course of producing that suffering, inadvertently set in motion. The labor markets that freed the survivors. The property redistribution that enriched the survivors' children. The vernacular literature that gave voice to what the survivors had experienced. The humanist philosophy that grew from the survivors' need to make sense of a world where institutional authority had failed. The public health institutions that the survivors' governments built to manage the next epidemic. The scientific inquiry that those institutions eventually demanded. The accounting is incomplete without both sides of the ledger. The institutions. The most enduring legacy of the Black Death is institutional. The health boards that Venice and Florence established in the 14th century were the ancestors of the national departments of public health that exist in every country today. The quarantine protocols that medieval port cities developed eventually standardized into the international health regulations that govern the global response to epidemic disease. The mortality records that medieval governments kept because they needed to know how many people were dying became the statistical systems that allow modern epidemiology to track disease patterns across populations. These institutions did not develop smoothly or without interruption. They were built, dismantled, rebuilt, reformed, corrupted, and reformed again across the centuries between the Black Death and the present. The path from the Venetian Lazaretto to the World Health Organization is not a straight line. But the institutions that exist today to manage epidemic disease owe their existence, in a real sense, to the specific emergency that the Black Death created, to the recognition, first articulated in the 14th century, that epidemic disease was a public problem that required a public response. The legal and economic institutions that the plague helped reshape were similarly durable. The decline of serfdom in Western Europe, which the plague's demographic shock accelerated, eventually produced the labor markets of the modern world. The commercial capitalism that the post-plague prosperity helped develop, the merchant families of Florence and Venice and Bruges managing property and investment in ways that the feudal economy had not permitted, eventually produced the financial systems of the modern economy. The connections are not simple, but they are real. A case study, The Mortality Bill. In 1592, the City of London began publishing weekly bills of mortality, official counts of the deaths in each parish, organized by cause, distributed to subscribers who paid for the information. The bills of mortality were not invented in 1592, they had predecessors in earlier epidemic monitoring, but the regular, systematic, citywide mortality reporting that they established was something new. It was the ancestor of the vital statistics systems that every modern country maintains, the direct institutional descendant of the counting that the Venetian government had started doing in 1347. John Graunt, a London haberdasher with no formal medical training, used the bills of mortality in the 1660s to produce the first systematic analysis of population patterns from statistical data, identifying regularities in birth and death rates, seasonal patterns in mortality, the differential survival of men and women, the long-term trends that only became visible when you looked at decades of data rather than individual years. His work founded the discipline of demography and contributed to the development of actuarial science and insurance. He was doing, with 17th-century data and 17th-century methods, something that the medieval governments who had started counting their dead could not have imagined but had made possible. The plague did not redeem its victims. Nothing could do that. But the survivors made a world from what it left. The mortality bills that Graunt analyzed were full of plague deaths. The 1665 epidemic that would be the last great plague outbreak in London was still a living memory when he published his natural and political observations in 1662. The plague that had started the counting, in Venice in 1347 and Florence in 1348, was still being counted in London 3 centuries later. And the counting, which had started as crisis management, had by Graunt's time become something else. The beginning of the science of how populations work. The world that didn't happen. The most speculative part of any historical accounting is the counterfactual, the question of what would have happened if the event had not occurred. The Black Death's counterfactual is particularly difficult because the event was so consequential that the world without it is barely imaginable. But the attempt is instructive. A Europe that had not experienced the Black Death would have been a more populous Europe, perhaps 500 million people by 1500 rather than the actual 350 million. It would have been a more hierarchically organized Europe, because the demographic shock that had given the peasantry its leverage and accelerated the dissolution of feudalism would not have occurred. It would have been a more Latin-literate Europe, because the clergy that had maintained the Latin intellectual tradition would not have been decimated. It would have been a Europe in which the institutional church retained more of the authority that the plague visibly eroded. Whether this alternative Europe would have been better or worse than the one that actually developed is not a question that can be answered. The Renaissance that the plague helped create was a genuine flowering of human possibility. The Reformation that followed it, whatever its costs, produced forms of individual religious practice that billions of people have found meaningful. The science that eventually grew from the empirical turn that the plague's discrediting of received authority helped produce has extended human life, reduced suffering, and expanded human capacity in ways that are difficult to overestimate. These things might have happened anyway. They might have happened sooner. They might have happened in different forms. We cannot know. What we can say is that they happened in the specific forms they did, in the specific sequence they did, partly because of a catastrophe that no one planned and no one could have predicted. The survivors. The Black Death left survivors. This seems obvious, but it is worth dwelling on. Out of everything that the epidemic destroyed, what it could not destroy was the specific category of people who had survived it. The survivors were not the same as the people they had been before. They were poorer in numbers, richer in goods, changed in their theology, their philosophy, their art, their language, their expectations. They were the generation that rebuilt, that produced children who rebuilt, that created institutions and ideas and works of art that the epidemic had made necessary by destroying the ones that had preceded them. The plague changed what it meant to be human in Europe. Not permanently, not in ways that can be measured with precision, but in ways that can be recognized in the literature and the art and the institutions and the philosophy that the post-plague generations produced. The awareness of mortality that saturates the culture of the late 14th and 15th centuries, the dancing skeletons, the carpe diem poetry, the humanist insistence on the value of this life is the awareness of people who had been forced to reckon with death on a scale that no previous European generation had experienced. That reckoning produced something. It produced the Renaissance and the Reformation and eventually the scientific revolution and the Enlightenment and everything that followed. These things had other causes too, many of them. The Black Death was not the sole explanation for modernity. But it was a condition of possibility, one of the specific historical events without which the world that followed would have been different in ways we cannot fully imagine. The survivors lived in that world. We are their inheritors. The plague is over, but the world it made is still being made. The historian William McNeill, whose Plagues and Peoples published in 1976 was the first major synthetic history of the relationship between epidemic disease and human civilization, argued that infectious disease had been a more important driver of historical change than war, politics, or economics, not because disease was more important in some absolute sense, but because it was more consistently underestimated. McNeill's argument, which seemed controversial when he made it, has become mainstream among historians of medicine and demographic history. The Black Death is his central case study, the epidemic that most clearly demonstrates how disease can change the course of human history in ways that no political decision or military campaign could replicate. Source: Plagues and Peoples, William McNeill, 1976. Chapter 17. The Disease That Is Still With Us. Yersinia pestis in the Modern World. The bacterium that didn't go away. Yersinia pestis did not become extinct when the plague retreated from Europe in the 17th century. It persists today, in the rodent populations of the western United States, in Central Asia, in parts of Africa and South America, the same ecological niches it has occupied for centuries, maintained in the same reservoirs, transmitted by the same fleas, waiting for the same opportunities that it has always exploited. Every year, a small number of people around the world are infected with plague. Most of them survive, treated with antibiotics that have been available since the 1940s. Some do not. In 2020, the year the world was focused on COVID-19, China reported a case of bubonic plague in Inner Mongolia. The patient had eaten a wild rabbit. In 2019, a couple in Mongolia died of plague after eating marmot meat and marmot kidney, a traditional remedy for good health. In the American Southwest, cases of plague appear in the human population every year, transmitted by the fleas of ground squirrels and prairie dogs, the ecological descendants of the steppe rodents that harbored the bacterium in 1346. The plague is not history. It is a condition of the present that history explains. The antibiotic treatment that makes modern plague survivable in most cases is not guaranteed to remain effective indefinitely. Antibiotic-resistant strains of Yersinia pestis have been identified in Madagascar, which has the highest burden of plague in the modern world, accounting for roughly 70% of global cases. The resistance arose from antibiotic overuse in human and animal populations, the same process that is creating antibiotic resistance in a range of other bacterial pathogens. The nightmare scenario that epidemiologists describe, a drug-resistant strain of plague establishing itself in a densely populated area with limited public health infrastructure, has not occurred. It remains possible. The third pandemic. The plague that retreated from Western Europe in the 17th century did not retreat from the world. The third pandemic, the global outbreak that began in Yunnan province in China in the 1850s and reached its peak in the 1890s and early 1900s, killed between 12 and 15 million people, mostly in India, which experienced the worst of the epidemic. The ships of the global trading network carried it to ports on every continent, San Francisco in 1900, Sydney in 1900, Cape Town in 1901. The third pandemic was different from the medieval Black Death in ways that reflect the specific character of the late 19th century world. It moved along steamship routes rather than medieval trade roads, which meant it moved faster and more globally but in more concentrated channels. It was most devastating in colonial India, where the combination of dense population, limited public health infrastructure, and the disruptions of British colonial policy created conditions of maximum vulnerability. The colonial authorities responded to the epidemic with measures that the local population experienced as violent and arbitrary: forced hospitalization, quarantine camps, the inspection and fumigation of personal property, and that triggered resistance, including the assassination of the British officer who administered the epidemic response in Pune. The third pandemic is also the pandemic during which the plague's mechanism was finally understood. In 1894, Alexandre Yersin isolated the causative bacterium in Hong Kong and described it accurately, a discovery for which the bacterium now bears his name. In 1898, Paul-Louis Simond demonstrated the role of the rat flea in transmission. The institutions of public health that the medieval plagues had prompted, the scientific methods that the Enlightenment had developed, and the specific crisis of the third pandemic combined to produce, within 50 years of the pandemic's peak, the understanding that had eluded medicine for 5.5 centuries. The world after the plague. The world the Black Death made is the world that modernity inherited. Not the only world that went into making modernity, there were 1,000 other events and processes and decisions that shaped the 5 centuries between the Black Death and the present. But the Black Death was among the most consequential single events in the making of the modern world, and it was consequential not because anyone planned it or because anyone correctly understood what it was doing while it was doing it, but because it was so large, so sudden, and so indiscriminate that it broke things that might otherwise have persisted for much longer, and in breaking them, cleared space for things that could not have grown in their shadow. The clearing was brutal. The things it cleared were not worthless: the medieval church, the feudal social order, the Latin intellectual tradition, the communities of craftsmen and monks and merchants who built the cathedrals and copied the manuscripts and managed the trade routes were not obstacles to progress that needed to be swept aside. They were human achievements, built over centuries, destroyed in months. The people who built them and died in them were not stepping stones to a better world. They were people. The bones of the dead are under our feet. The institutions they left behind are the institutions we are still arguing about, still reforming, still failing and rebuilding. But the world that followed was also a human achievement, built by the survivors on the foundation and the ruins of what had come before. The Renaissance and the Reformation and the scientific revolution and the public health systems and the vernacular literatures and the labor markets that the plague helped create are also human achievements, also the product of human ingenuity and courage and the specific determination to make something meaningful from what remained. The plague did not redeem its victims. Nothing could do that. But the survivors made a world from what the plague left, and that world, in ways large and small, is still the world we inhabit. The bones of the dead are under our feet. The institutions they left behind, or that their deaths made possible, are the institutions we are still arguing about, still reforming, still failing and rebuilding. The story is not over. It is the story we are in. The complete book is available in our store, link in the description below. Subscribe for more history, and we'll see you in the next one.